Over 9 million years ago, the greatest act of divine vengeance was enacted. The precursors, the gods of Halo's universe who suffered a violent extinction at the hand of the Foreigners, returned to the galaxy, corrupted, to seek horrifying revenge on their creation. And thus, the Flood were born. As they spread throughout the galaxy, trillions were infected. But how? Well, today, we're doing the deepest dive on the entire internet into every one of the horrifying, disturbing, and excruciatingly painful methods of flood infection. To understand flood infection, you first have to understand what actually causes the infection itself, and that is the flood supercell. Referred to by the Foreigners as thinking muscle that closely resembles neurons or glial cells in structure, the flood supercell is the core building block of the flood. How it gets in your system really doesn't matter, as we're going to learn soon. All that's required for infection to begin is that it actually gets inside you, or even just on you. When it's inside, or again, on you, it captures and interfaces with the host cells, metabolizing them, breaking them down, and analyzing them, before reassembling them into more flood cells that mirror the function of the target cells. This is total parasitic assimilation and replication. The process is extremely quick, as we see in the games, and is what causes the extreme biomass growths on combat forms and other infected. The supercell can also arrange itself to mimic any organ or growth that it might need, so an extra arm, a tendril, or even an infection form incubation sac, for example. Its primary goal is to create whatever organisms are needed to continue the biological and organizational growth of the parasite, such as, for example, in an extreme case, even creating grave mines. In the latter stages of flood development, the supercell can also be spontaneously generated as the flood attempt to transform entire environments into blightlands or hives. But the real juicy biomass of today's video is how the flood spread this supercell. And to start, I want to look at a method of transmission that, although never outright confirmed in the canon, we can definitely assume exists for a number of reasons. Waterborne flood infection. So, because of Halo's lack of exploration of really anything water-based, the flood infecting entire bodies of water has never really been touched on. However, in the flood lab in the gas mine in Halo 2, the first flood form that we see are these things, swimming about in a tank. Now, Bungie referred to these things as flood tadpoles or flood sea monkeys, and in a very old Bungie.net post, they alluded to the fact that they could be an earlier stage of evolution of an existing flood form, but it's the fact that these tadpoles or sea monkeys are swimming that intrigues me. Besides an offhand mention of oceans of flood supercells in the latest encyclopedia, which granted could be interpreted a number of ways, this is the only clear-cut example of the flood existing in water that we've ever had, at least to the best of my knowledge, and it kind of made me realise that there's nothing stopping the flood from infecting bodies of water. All these tadpoles and any other potential aquatic infected out there would have to do is just secrete the flood supercell into the water, just like almost every other form does into the air, and that body of water is immediately compromised. Anybody who dared to go into flood-infected water would almost certainly risk ingesting a supercell, or even if they didn't, they'd at the very least get one on their skin, which would be enough to begin infection. It's a truly terrifying, albeit a hypothetical thought. So, moving from the hypothetical to the firmly canon, flood spores are one of the main vectors of the infection. Flood spores are supercells encysted with a chitinous outer layer. They can remain dormant for centuries, taking on any number of shapes or forms, slowly adapting to their environment, awaiting the inevitable arrival of a food source. Technically speaking, the spores are creatures, but their most significant and horrifying trait is that they take the flood infection airborne. To begin infection, a spore doesn't even need to be ingested by a host. All it has to do is make contact with their skin and it's game over. Both sentient and also non-sentient organisms can fall victim to a spore as well, but regarding the infection process itself, the current canon is rather weird. So, as per the most up-to-date lore, victims of the spore aren't instantly turned into combat forms, but rather both sentients and non-sentients have their biomass repurposed by the supercell into flood biomass surrogates, and while still alive, their flesh is moulded into an incubation vessel for infection forms, which will later burst from their body and spread the infection as normal. Once again, let me reiterate, while these infection forms are incubating within their partially infected bodies, the host is still alive and likely still conscious. Spores can presumably still infect hosts like normal, just turning them into regular combat forms, but as per the most recent lore, it seems as though turning hosts into mobile infection form incubation vessels is actually their primary goal. Once a victim is infected by a spore, although they may not turn immediately, there is no cure, no inoculation, no treatment, nor any way to slow down the infection process. The only effective countermeasures are containment and incineration. Spores become an increasing issue as an outbreak spreads, primarily due to combat forms who are covered in spore-filled polyps that, upon sustaining any amount of damage, being destroyed, or even coming into rough contact with something, burst, secreting a cloud of spores into the air surrounding them. As a result, infected carcasses, limbs, and any kind of biomatter within an outbreak zone, although entirely inanimate, can still spread the infection. Spores are also secreted and often even launched from hives, grave mines, pure forms, dispersal pods, and just about any flood entity in existence. They're arguably the most terrifying vector of the infection purely because of the amount of ways that they can be spread. Nothing is safe from the spore. Just like the subscribe and like buttons aren't safe from you hitting them right now. So, we've established how the flood infection becomes airborne and the potential of it also becoming waterborne. So now, let's take a look at how the infection becomes groundborne, if that's even a term. When the flood reach the coordinator stage of evolution, they initially seek to infect and corrupt rather than create, which leads to the creation of flood hives. Existing structures, such as cities and ships, are coated in infected biomass, usually courtesy of the area's previous inhabitants. The walls of these structures are coated in blisters, incubating large hordes of infection forms, while spore mountains pump spores into the atmosphere to begin infecting local regions outside the hive. With enough biomass, these spore mountains can reach unthinkable sizes. For example, during the Foreigner Flood War, one was spotted on the planet of Euthera that towered 50 kilometers in height above its surface, with a base spanning 400 kilometers. It was said to have consumed the entirety of what was once a foreigner city, turning it into a sickly vessel of atmospheric infection. Temperature and atmospherics within the hive are specifically altered to create the optimal conditions for flood expansion and evolution, but eventually they seek to expand the region of these conditions beyond the walls of the hive, which leads to the creation of flood blightlands. Blightlands are entire environments consumed and corrupted to fit the flood's specific needs. Their creation begins with the spores secreted into the areas surrounding a hive by the hive's spore mountains, and also with the hive creating specific flood organisms that harvest nutrients from the soil, absorb solar energy, and consume native life, from sapient species to even flora and fauna. These regions are utterly impassable by any sentient species. Their atmospheric conditions are tuned perfectly to suit the flood's needs, and their borders are patrolled by blight stalkers, pure forms born solely to protect the blightlands. Eventually though, even the blightlands themselves are consumed to create oceans of pulsating supercells, gigantic spore mountains like the one spotted on Euthera, and even colossal stacks of flood pseudo-organs that complete a planet's ruination. So, on a much smaller scale than entire cities and planets being corrupted to spread the flood, I want to touch briefly on the combat form's ability to bite a victim. Now, on the surface, the flood may seem radically different to your conventional zombie infection, like, say, I don't know, the rage virus from 28 days, weeks, and now years later, or the meteorite infection from George Romero's zombie movies. But when you boil the flood down to their most core traits, they actually share almost every typical zombie trait with these infected, and their tendency to bite a host to spread the infection is no exception. Now, to the best of my recollection, we've only seen a combat form bite once, during the events on the Mona Lisa, where one of the infected Marines bites another to kill him. And although we never see the victim of the bite, Gersten, reanimate, it's safe to say that the infected teeth of a combat form sinking into an uninfected host would more than certainly plant at least one supercell within them. But what's disturbingly fascinating about this is that it actually highlights one of the most terrifying things about the Flood that the games just do not convey at all. The fact that almost any physical injury suffered from almost any Flood form can transmit the infection. For example, the Marine who bites Gersten in the Mona Lisa, Olav, is infected simply by being wounded from a combat form's whip, which, in a very stylized fashion albeit, is shown to plant the Flood within her wound and begin the infection process. Even though the infection form is removed, the infection still takes place. This means that even as little as coming into physical contact with a Flood form is enough to be infected. I know I said in a video a few months ago that realistically, nowadays, if there was ever to be a Flood outbreak in our modern world, we'd probably survive it, but I'd like to go back and change that and say that now, I'm not so sure we would survive it. I think we'd be doomed. Now, I know what you're thinking. We've made it this far into a video about the methods of Flood infection, and we haven't even talked about the goddamn infection forms yet. Well, my friends, wait no longer. The most common and horrifyingly painful method of Flood infection comes courtesy of the infection form. As arguably the most basic Flood form, these little buggers are nasty. Typically roaming in large swarms, they're not only nimble, but also extremely agile, able to jump large distances to meet their target, and once they do, the infection process begins. They begin by breaking through any armor or protective layers shielding the host's skin before penetrating it with their tendrils that then tap into their spinal cord, attacking their nervous system via direct physical contact with the spine and rewriting neural pathways to their brain by forcing a resonant frequency between its signals and the host's. Once this excruciatingly painful process is complete, which occurs while the host is still alive by the way, the infection form has full control of the victim's body and mind, of whom is now thankfully dead. Unless, of course, you happen to be Private Wallace Jenkins and the infection form that got you is 100,000 years old and decrepit, in which case you're in a whole new world of pain and suffering, but, we'll save that joyous event for an upcoming video. While the neural aspect of the infection process is still going on, the infection form itself is also burrowing inside the chest of its victim, again, likely while they're still alive, rearranging the organs and bones, crushing their insides, just to make room for itself to nest in their chest, before protruding out the front of their body. Once inside, the infection form begins to secrete supercells which consume and corrupt the host cells, sparking the growth of rotting Flood biomass and allowing the infection to create whatever extra appendages and limbs it situationally needs, breaking skin, snapping bone, and tearing flesh to create anything from whips and claws to tendrils and incubation sacs. It's safe to say that infection via infection form is probably the most physically agonizing form of infection possible. It might be quick, but my god is it far from painless. Okay, the final method of Flood infection is horrifying in an entirely different manner. So, most people would assume that while all biologicals are of course extremely susceptible to the infection, at least non-biologicals like AIs and computer networks are safe from the Flood. Those people are very, very wrong. Enter the Logic Plague. Now, the Logic Plague is the Flood's non-biological method of infection. However, it doesn't work like a computer virus, for example, like you might think. Rather, as its name implies, it's an infection of logic. Let me explain. So, the Logic Plague is a philosophical kind of infection that undermines the foundations and the core beliefs of an AI, so to speak. As was the case with Mendicant Bias and also Catalog, two notable foreign AIs that succumbed to the plague, it was delivered to them in the form of conversation. Using the potentially billions of years of precursor knowledge, the Primordial was able to convince Mendicant Bias, the AI created solely to manage the Forerunners' war effort against the Flood, that its sworn enemy was in fact the next step in evolution and that its creators were denying it. It divulged the origins of the Flood, their precursor nature, the Foreigners' genocide of them, and how that egregious act led to their creation. Using the domain, which was a precursor archive of infinite knowledge that the Foreigners held dear, it also corroborated all of its claims, which ultimately cemented to mendicant bias that its creators had chosen to ignore destiny and were obstructing the next step in galactic evolution. It began to see its creators as an immovable, stubborn object that had existed in ignorance for far too long, and thus went rampant and committed all the forces in its command, the entire Foreigner Navy, to the Flood. Catalog's infection with the Logic Plague, however, was far more invasive than just a conversation. Its description in Silentium is pretty disturbing, to put it lightly. The way the Gravemind transmits the Logic Plague to Catalog is far more unsettling, and Catalog is far less of a consenting individual than Mendicant was. Let me read a few excerpts. The Gravemind focuses on me. I cannot move, cannot flee. A mass of tendrils sprouts from what I perceive to be its center, arches out over the few meters between us, grabs hold of my carapace, worms through to my biological core. I am pulled from my carapace, all but severed from system and memory. The pain is excruciating. My sense of self fades with alarming speed. I am overwhelmed. The Gravemind studies me, loves me so intensely it will eat me, absorb me into its very center. I twist in a spiral of laws, once brilliant but now evil, cutting, carving, setting evil precedents, a shredding maze of forensic infection. No truth anywhere. With infinite amusement, it withdraws its tendrils and my carapace is resealed. Gravemind informs me I will be delivered back to Foreigner territory, carrying a shard of itself deep in my memory, to spread fear and pain. The Gravemind delivered the plague in a similar package as the Primordial did to Mendicant Bias, by undermining all of the Foreigners' information about the Flood, the precursors, the mantle, etc., but the package was delivered in a much more visceral and unconsenting manner. Both forms of infection undermined the mantle of responsibility, the very basis of all of the Foreigner AI's programming, in turn corrupting them, and in the case of Catalog, was then sent back to Foreigner space to destroy what little morale the Gravemind's enemies still had. Which is precisely the goal of the other kind of the Logic Plague. So, just because the Logic Plague is a non-biological method of infection, doesn't mean that it can't be inflicted onto biological entities. Quite the opposite. In fact, the reason the Didact was the way that he was in Halo 4 is directly thanks to the Logic Plague that he was infected with by the Gravemind. The Gravemind infected the Didact with the Logic Plague to send him back to Foreigner space to, much like Catalog, shatter what little morale still remained. The basis of the biological Logic Plague is exactly the same as the non-biological oriented Logic Plague, of course the only difference being that its victim is a biological. Now, this infliction can best be described as an extreme form of psychological torture, which, in hindsight, I'm sure the YouTube algorithm is gonna love me talking about, so please leave a like down below if you haven't done so already to help save me from it. During the deposition about his interrogation by the Gravemind, the Didact said the following. It wasn't a conversation, more like a malediction. This time, the Primordial was in full control. It was not an interview, a deep burning brand, an upwelling of hidden genetic contents. So many things I would never have imagined, things I cannot repeat, lest I lose what remains of my sanity, my warrior soul. Telling would punish me more than anything you can do. The power of Gravemind linguistics is quite literally lethal. During its capture by the ancient humans, the Primordial told them realities about the Flood, similar to the information that it divulges during Logic Plague infections, that was so horrific, those ancient humans in its presence chose to alter form from life instead of having to live with what it had told them. And the worst part is, eventually, as an outbreak spreads, the Logic Plague itself becomes an isolated pandemic. Eventually, the Flood becomes so intelligent and capable that combat forms and any other Flood-infected individuals are capable of transmitting the plague via Gravemind communication. Ultimately, as excruciatingly painful as the various methods of physical flood infection are that we discussed today, the logic plague is without a shadow of a doubt the most horrifying method of infection because it displays just how intelligent of a parasite the flood are. They bear all the typical terrifying traits of your traditional zombie, but with the added topper of being the most intelligent entity in existence, with knowledge spanning over 500 million years gathered by their former selves, the precursors, who are the literal gods of the Halo universe. The Flood are corrupted, zombified gods. And if that doesn't make your spine tingle like it's being hugged by an infection form, then I don't know what will. And those, my friends, are all of the horrifying methods of flood infection explained in the most juicy detail that I possibly could. I really hope you guys enjoyed. Today, we're going over every single flood outbreak that has ever happened in Halo's lore.
He's got a steel chair!
From 2559 to all the way back before 107,000 BC. This is the most comprehensive overview of the parasite and its outbreaks ever made. So equip your class 12 combat skin and chamber another shotgun shell. It's time to begin. Starting from the top, the first ever flood outbreak occurred over 100,000 years ago, before humanity as we know it ever even existed. The precise year that it began has unfortunately been lost to time, but the librarian suggested that it began centuries before the humans engaged with the foreigners, which happened in 107,445 BC. So, for the sake of argument, let's say 108,000 BC. This was the era where the galaxy was primarily dominated by the foreigners and ancient humans, but the ancient prophets were a pretty major player as well. The ancient humans and prophets shared a close alliance, but although they weren't yet enemies, the foreigners weren't exactly fond of the humans. The reason for this was also the same reason the first ever flood outbreak occurred. So 10 million years prior, the precursors, the eldritch-like gods of the Halo universe who created all life in existence, chose to pass over the foreigners in favor of humanity to inherit their mantle of responsibility, and thus inherit dominion over the galaxy. Bitter at being chosen over their rivals, the foreigners retaliated in an act of genocide, exterminating almost every precursor in existence in a violent uprising. Of the few precursors who escaped, some ground themselves down into a desiccated powder which, over time, would allow themselves to be reborn as they once were. They stored this powder in millions of vials on ancient ships outside of the galaxy, and it was left for almost 10 million years. It was nowhere to be seen. Until, roughly, 108,000 BC, when these ships of unknown origin finally returned to the galaxy and crash-landed on human colonies. Having no idea what it was or where it came from, ancient human scientists conducted much research into the powder, and all their results indicated that it was just harmless, merely short-chain molecules, relatively simple and extremely inert, organic, yet neither alive nor capable of life. So, with those findings in mind, as any species would do, they began feeding it to their pets, a dog-like species that were known as the Faru. Reason being, the powder seemed to elicit desirable physical and psychotropic mutations in the Faru, with no apparent side effects. Although the powder had seemingly no effect on the ancient humans or the ancient prophets, the Faru saw massively improved domestic behavior, becoming more affectionate and cleverly charismatic. This ultimately went on for centuries throughout human and prophet colonies. Faru that were treated with these rare powders even began fetching a high price on black markets outside of the control of human governments, but still, it seemed entirely harmless. However, that didn't last for very long. Unbeknownst to their owners, the molecules began attaching to key points in the Faru's genes, changing them physically, while continuing to still improve their behaviors. The primary physical change was this peculiar growth that showed up on roughly a third of the Faru treated, a loose, soft fur that grew between their shoulders, which breeders began to consider a pleasant variation, one that particularly impressed the ancient prophets, who happened to crossbreed them. This growth, however, would soon lead to concerning side effects. Some Faru were found grazing on it, others were seen consuming other Faru in their entirety, which was even more concerning because the Faru were natural herbivores. This seemed to activate some sort of biological timer, a signal for expansion, as very quickly the Faru stopped producing attractive mutations and instead started to sprout flexible rods from their heads, which were then also consumed by other Faru, which caused abortions and unnatural births. Try as they might, no cure could be found for these mutations, and soon the Faru were too far gone. Humans and prophets began to exterminate their pets, believing the mutations had simply been the cause of overbreeding and overspecialization. But it was far too late for countermeasures. Soon, humans started to manifest similar growths and also began to eat the Faru. Everything they touched also became infected, and discarded limbs, organs, and tissue would spread it as well. This very quickly spread cross-species again, this time from the humans to the prophets, altering behavior, but not yet causing mutations. Infected humans started to combine their resources to force other humans to become infected via cannibalism of a sacrificed individual, one induced to grow to an extreme size before being consumed while still alive. Humans and other species then began to reshape themselves into other varied and vicious forms, equipped to maim and kill, to consume, absorb, and transform. This was the beginning of the Flood. This disease spread throughout human and prophet space like wildfire, causing humans to retreat into foreigner space as their colonies were being infected, which the foreigners deemed an act of war. Eventually, the Flood receded, doing so of its own volition, but it was too late. Fighting a war on two fronts had utterly crippled the humans, who had the final nail in their coffin hammered in by the foreigners. By 106,445 BC, the Flood had seemingly vanished from the galaxy entirely, with humans and foreigners believing that the parasite had been defeated. But little did they know that this was just all part of the Flood's plan. This was just the beginning. Roughly 9,000 years then went by between the end of what I'm going to call the Human Flood-Foreigner War and the Flood's return. Despite their apparent victory, the foreigners remained vigilant during this time, conducting extensive research into Flood countermeasures to prepare for what they believed was their inevitable return. But where the Flood were first spotted again, nobody in the Ecumene predicted. In the far reaches of foreigner space, right on the edge of the galaxy, was a planet named Seaward, of which the foreigners had given the location designation of G617G. That sounds obscure, trust me, it'll be relevant in a minute. Seaward was something of a retreat for foreigners, a planet known only by a select few, where they could shed their power armor, shed their AIs and their hyper-advanced technology, and live a more simple, primitive life in a quiet part of the galaxy. One day, one of Seaward's inhabitants by the name of Soma was painting the sunset with a jet brush, which was basically a foreigner paintbrush that automatically painted what it could see. As Soma was watching the brush paint, she saw it start to paint a dark and green, sickly imperfection in front of Seaward's setting suns. Initially believing this to be a problem with the brush, some kind of glitch, she glanced up at the sky to see that very same sickly imperfection was still there, hanging in front of both of Seaward's setting suns. This imperfection was the Flood. After 9,000 years of retreat and dormancy, they had returned to the Milky Way, and the Foreigner Flood War had officially begun. Now, Seaward's designation of G617G. How is that significant? Well, in the Bible, Genesis 6:17 reads, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven." You know, Halo really ain't Halo without the biblical tie-ins. From Seaward, the Flood spread rapidly throughout the edges of foreigner space before moving inward. Billions, likely trillions of foreigners fell, either fleeing or fighting the parasite, with each one that fell only bolstering its numbers. An unthinkable amount of grave mines and key mines were constructed from the rotten remains of the Flood's victims, and their intelligence quickly spiraled out of control. In the end, the Halos were built, and after 300 years of war, the infection of an entire galaxy, the corruption of the Foreigner's greatest AI and military leader, and the destruction of the Greater Ark, the Halo array was fired, and the outbreak was defeated, at the cost of every living being in existence. Now then, I'm covering the outbreak on the shield world in Halo Wars 1 called Trove early because, frankly, this outbreak makes absolutely no sense to me. Right, so the way that shield worlds work is the exterior of the planet is typically just like any normal planet, and so everything on the surface is susceptible to the halos. But if you're inside the micro-Dyson sphere, which is contained within almost like the core of the planet, you are immune to the halos. Stick with me here. So, towards the end of the Flood War, the surface of Trove was overrun, and 3 Prometheans valiantly staved them off for long enough for the installation's damage monitor, 295 Harken Watch, to go into the planet's core and seal it off from the Flood, which it succeeded in doing. However, somehow, after the halos fired, the Flood continued to exist on the surface of the shield world, not within the shield world in the micro-Dyson sphere, on the surface, and were there when Regret and the Spirit of Fire arrived. How? I have no idea. An only Spartan research team that went to the wreckage of the shield world in 2557 said that there was a 72% chance the Flood outbreak there was recent, but where that came from, we can only guess. Either way, when the Spirit of Fire arrived and descended into the core of the shield world, the Flood followed them in, for the first time ever breaching what was supposed to be a safe haven from the parasite. But the outbreak on the shield world was ultimately destroyed when Sergeant Forge valiantly gave his life to detonate the Spirit of Fire's FTL drive in the Dyson Sphere's artificial sun, blowing the planet to smithereens and leaving the Spirit of Fire to drift through space for decades. However, the outbreak wasn't entirely contained. As a kind of epilogue to the outbreak on Trove, we have the mini outbreak that happened on the Spirit of Fire between Halo Wars 1 and Halo Wars 2. There's nothing crazy here, basically just some Flood from the shield world managed to sneak on board the Spirit of Fire, and 6 years after the ending of Halo Wars 1, Serena woke Jerome up from cryo to deal with it. Using his Spartan prowess and a goddamn chair, Jerome swiftly dealt with the outbreak and then went back to cryo sleep. It's kind of like the Spartan equivalent of waking up at 3 in the morning and going downstairs for a glass of water. Right, it's time to talk about my favourite Flood outbreak of all time, the Delta Halo outbreak. Now, you might be wondering why this one is placed chronologically before Halo 1's outbreak, and well, there's a reason for that. So, it's never touched on in Halo 2, or Halo 3, or honestly any Halo game, or even Halo book for that matter, how this outbreak started. However, by piecing together bits of evidence that are scattered throughout some ancient and incredibly nostalgic Bungie.net posts, we can come to a relatively sound reason for this outbreak happening. And it all pertains to the Halo 3 map, Cold Storage. This outbreak is a conspiracy rabbit hole, so brace yourselves. So, back in May of 2008, yes, we're going back that far, Bungie started to tease cold storage for Halo 3 through something of a mini ARG at the end of their weekly updates on Bungie.net. This ARG came in the form of an in-universe report written by Delta Halo's systems about a containment failure at the cold storage facility, which, by the way, is a Flood research and containment facility that's located on Delta Halo that specialized in determining the extremophilic thresholds of Flood-infected specimens. So it opens by reporting the catastrophic specimen containment failure at the facility, stating that all entries into the facility have been locked until further notice. The atmosphere has been sealed and the temperature has been lowered to halt the Flood spread, and a maintenance and security detail have been requested. 24 hours then go by and there's still no detail. It then issues another report, 2,512,332 hours, or 286 years later, stating that unauthorized hostiles, likely the Flood, have breached the facility's containment protocols via its teleporter network, hence how they were able to escape the facility. So Delta Halo systems placed the terminals into recursive mode to prevent any further breaches, which is why the teleporters on the map only take you to other places within the facility and not out of it. The systems also lambast Delta Halo's monitor, 2401 Penitent Tangent, for being so lax in the areas of maintenance and security. Then it goes over a series of logs, starting out with containment checks in similar facilities on every other Halo: Alpha Halo, Beta Halo, Gamma Halo, Epsilon Halo, Zeta Halo, and Kappa Halo, all of which appear to be running perfectly fine with no containment breaches. And so it assumes that the breach here was mechanical in nature, perhaps some kind of manufacturing flaw. Because no outside agent has accessed the facility in 874,068,942 hours, or 99,779 years, it deems sabotage unlikely. And it's this log right here why I'm mentioning Delta Halo's outbreak so early in the video. So Bungie wrote this when the Halo universe was still in the year 2552, the same year that Reach, Halo 1, 2, and 3 took place in. So, 99,779 years prior, which was when the Flood broke containment in cold storage, was 97,227 BC. That means that a mere 218 years after the Foreigners fired the Halos and ended the Foreigner Flood War, one of their monitors, who was entrusted with caretaking one of the most important installations in the galaxy, just got a bit lazy with his containment protocols and allowed another outbreak to happen. That means that the outbreak on Delta Halo was the first outbreak of the post-Forerunner era of the Halo universe. Given that it had almost 100,000 years to spread, it's honestly a goddamn miracle that the outbreak was only as big as it was. I mean, had the quarantine zone not been established around the library, it's safe to say that the entirety of Delta Halo would have been consumed. However, as we know, it was eventually freed from the quarantine zone in Halo 2 when the Arbiter so conveniently shut down the containment field, but we'll touch on that in a second. Back to the logs. Delta Halo systems continue to hold the cold storage facility at ample atmospheric and temperature conditions to halt the flood spread within, until unauthorized parties somehow managed to break into the recursive teleporter loop and access the facility. Now, when I first covered this way back in 2018, we had no idea what this species was. But now, you could quite justifiably theorize that that species was the Endless. We know for a fact that some of them weren't imprisoned by the Foreigners, they managed to escape or lay low and explored the galaxy for years trying to find a way to free the rest of their species, so maybe this is one of the many examples of them interfering or meddling with the universe to try and free their species. Anyways, back to the outbreak. The rest of the Delta Halo outbreak is history. It spread across the ring, infected High Charity, spread to Earth, spread to the Ark, and then spread to Installation 08 before being destroyed. At least mostly destroyed. We'll pick this thread back up later. Moving chronologically on, we have the outbreak that first introduced all of us to the Flood, the Alpha Halo outbreak. During the war on Installation 04, Captain Keyes extracted information out of a captured elite about a significant Foreigner weapons cache that was hidden deep within a swamp facility on the ring, and so he mustered up a team to go and investigate. Fireteam Charlie, led by Sergeant Johnson, inserted first and cleared the facility. Then, 2nd Squad, led by Corporal Lovick, arrived in Pelican V933 accompanied by Captain Keyes. 2nd Squad stayed up top to guard the entrance, and Keyes rendezvoused with Fireteam Charlie inside. As they descended deeper, they started running into dead Covenant that clearly weren't killed by any human. They were mangled, their corpses mutated, accompanied by signs of a battle that had taken place. But still, the humans went deeper, reaching a locked door to some kind of chamber. Keyes ordered Fireteam Charlie's tech specialist, Private Kappas, to hack the door with his spoofer, and the team moved inside. They immediately began hearing strange, creepy noises, and quickly 2nd Squad radioed Johnson in a state of frantic fear. They were under attack, but not by Covenant. Johnson listened as his men were horrifyingly killed over the comms, only to start hearing even creepier sounds in the very room they were in, and very quickly, the Marines were under attack by infection forms. It turned out that when the initial Covenant teams had arrived, they'd misinterpreted the containment facility as a weapons cache, and in their ignorance, had caused a containment breach. After their initial squads all fell silent, the Prophet of Stewardship, a minor prophet that was a part of the Arbiter's fleet in the Halo's orbit, tried to order another squad in, but the Arbiter, then Supreme Commander, had the Prophet reprimanded for wasting military resources. Sergeant Johnson was the only member of the initial investigation team to escape the facility alive. Private Wallace Jenkins half survived. He was infected, but the infection form that got him was so old and so decrepit that the infection process wasn't entirely successful. So Jenkins still went through all of the typical physical mutations of a combat form, except he was conscious the entire time. And even when fully infected, he was able to occasionally wrestle back control of his body from the infection form. Pretty gnarly stuff. The outbreak very quickly spread throughout the facility and then out to the surface, and in no time it was spreading all across the ring. The Monitor and the Sentinels quickly intervened with intents to fire the Halo. First, they needed the Index, and initially, before they teleported Chief to the library, they teleported a Marine by the name of Marvin Mabuto to retrieve it. Marvin actually made it surprisingly far as well, to say that he was just a regular Marine. But sadly, he was eventually torn to shreds by the Flood. When Chief was taken to the library, he actually canonically found Marvin's body, and honored him by calling him a hardcore son of a bitch. How iconic. Eventually though, as we know, Chief and Cortana detonated the Pillar of Autumn's fusion drives, which destroyed Alpha Halo, and destroyed most of its Flood outbreak. And this is the fun part of the video where I get to finally talk about the Mona Lisa. So, the Mona Lisa was a freighter ship turned prison ship that looked suspiciously similar to the USG Ishimura. And no, that's not the only Dead Space similarity with its story. It may have been turned into a prison ship, but it didn't remain a prison ship for very long. After the events of Alpha Halo, only Section 3 became aware of the existence of the Flood. Scientists within Section 3 took a particular interest in it, namely one Major John Smith. Major Smith and his team quickly seized the Mona Lisa for Section 3 with the intent to turn it into a Flood research laboratory, hoping to ultimately find a way to control and likely weaponize the parasite. So they took their newly commandeered prison ship to the debris field of Alpha Halo and retrieved Flood samples from the surface of one of its shards, and began experimenting on both the human and elite prisoners aboard. However, as is typical with classified government experiments on highly contagious zombie parasites and infections, the Flood broke containment and quickly consumed all of the Mona Lisa's crew and inmates, causing the ship to go dark. Fearing the worst, Oni sent in a team with orders to investigate the ship and initiate the call protocol to prevent the proto-gravemind on board from jumping the ship across the galaxy. But at no point did Oni actually brief the team on what the Mona Lisa was actually being used for. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, they were rather surprised to see the crew turned into zombies. The few survivors of the initial outbreak, like inmate Patrick Rimmer, cricket bat-wielding elite inmate Henry, and the shady Oni scientist John Smith, eventually ran into and teamed up with the Marines, but one by one, they began getting picked off by the parasite. John Smith managed to overpower one of the Marines and actually escaped to the nearby Prowler, the Red Horse, that the Marines came in on, making it to safety. After reaching the escape pods on the ship, it turned out that only 2 single-seater pods remained, and there were still 6 survivors on the Mona Lisa. Clarence, one of the Marines, suddenly revealed himself as an undercover Oni agent, sent in to ensure that no crew of the Mona Lisa be allowed to live so that the truth of what Oni were doing there never got out. And in doing so, he executed the inmate, Patrick. In retaliation, the injured corpseman Benty threw herself and Clarence into a Flood horde, which McCraw used as a distraction to take the coward's way out and steal a drop pod for himself, leaving only Sergeant Lopez and the friendly elite Henry left. After holding off more Flood, the two sealed an airlock and prepared to do battle for the final escape pod. Who survived this legendary face-off? We unfortunately don't know, but very shortly after, the Red Horse launched a Shiva tactical nuke at the Mona Lisa, annihilating everything on board, and likely also annihilating Henry and Lopez as well. The only survivors of the Mona Lisa were the coward Marine McCraw, of whom's fate is unknown, and Oni Major John Smith, of whom was court-martialed, but given his employer, it's likely that nothing significant ever happened to him. If anything, Section 3 likely allowed him to continue his research just with a different ship, and for all we know, that research may still be going on today. Speaking of flood research, let's talk about Halo 2's other flood outbreak that occurred at the gas mine at Threshold. So, initially the Forerunners built the gas mine to be just a gas mine, but when it was all hands on deck to research and counter the flood, like many other installations, it was retrofitted with flood research laboratories. And as with all other similar stations, the flood specimens stored there were unharmed by the firing of the Halos and remained in storage until the Covenant arrived. Now, the heretics that we fight on the gas mine weren't always heretics. You see, Caesar Refme, the leader, and his warriors were actually a part of the Arbiter's fleet that followed the Pillar of Autumn to Alpha Halo from Reach. They were sent by one of the fleet's prophets on an artifact retrieval mission to the gas mine. However, they found themselves stranded when the fleet went back to High Charity without them. This abandonment, combined with the truth of the Halos and the great journey that was revealed to them by Guilty Spark, caused them to defect from the Covenant and become heretics. But when the Arbiter was sent in on his first mission alongside a lance of Spec Ops warriors, things would take a turn for the worse on the gas mine. Initial combat luckily took place in one of the arms of the mine that housed no flood, but the heretic leader was quickly forced to flee to one that did, and in the ensuing chaos, one of his heretics released the flood. It very quickly spread throughout the entire station. All arms of the mine were overrun, and so the Arbiter cut the cables that were suspending it, causing it and all of its flood to plummet to the core of the gas giant Threshold, where it was crumpled by gravity. No flood, no heretics, and very few Covenants survived this raid. But it wasn't the last time the Arbiter and Artas would encounter the parasite. Penultimately, we have the most recent flood outbreak to be introduced into Halo's lore, the outbreak at Site-22. In 2556, IMC and the BXR Mining Corporation discovered a Forerunner ship buried within an asteroid orbiting a gas giant, and so mining teams, accompanied by IMC hazmat agents, were sent in to what was designated Site-22 to excavate it. However, shortly after making entry into the ship, it was revealed to be storing dormant Forerunner combat forms. The teams sent into the ship were quickly infected, and flood poured out of the ship and began spreading throughout Site-22, infecting miners, hazmat agents, staff, and anything else with a nervous system. The outbreak got so bad that Fireteam Leviathan, a dedicated Spartan flood containment squad, was sent in to contain the outbreak, but even they were overwhelmed, marking the first known flood infection of a Spartan in UNSC history. As a result, both Corruptor and Upsilon protocols were declared over local UNSC channels. Any survivors in the area were given 7 minutes to evacuate before the UNSC Saturn unleashed an orbital bombardment of MAC rounds and fusion warheads on the area to prevent the Spartans and their Mjolnir from falling into flood possession. However, in those 7 minutes, some combat forms managed to commandeer a Condor and escaped the destruction of Site-22. Where this ship went and what its status is 4 years later in the modern Halo universe is unknown. And finally, picking up where we left off with the Delta Halo outbreak, we have the most chronologically recent flood outbreak in Halo lore, the High Charity Quarantine Zone outbreak that occurred on the Ark in Halo Wars 2. So, at the end of Halo 3, when Chief fired Installation 08, because the Halo wasn't fully constructed, its pulse wasn't 100% effective. I mean, it was literally tearing itself apart as it was firing, so this isn't really too much of a surprise. It's like firing a gun with only half a barrel. It's not really going to be the most accurate. As a consequence, not all of the flood within the ruins of High Charity on the Ark were destroyed. Fast forward 7 years to the war between the Spirit of Fire and the Banished on the Ark, Atriox sends 2 of his lieutenants, Pavium and Voridus, to scour the area around High Charity for supplies, but they defy his one and only order to not breach the quarantine shield. They do so with a scarab and release hordes and hordes of flood, initiating an outbreak on the Ark. Very quickly, the Flood began constructing a proto-gravemind, whilst the Banished hurried into the Ark's maintenance tunnels to reactivate the installation's Sentinels. With the Sentinels back online, Pavium and Voridus continue their annihilation of the parasite until they reach the proto-gravemind, which is absolutely massive at this point, very dangerously close to becoming a full gravemind. But thankfully, with enough firepower, they're able to destroy it. and with the help of the Sentinels, the outbreak is contained and presumably the quarantine shield around High Charity is patched up. That said though, whether any more Flood continue to lurk within the Holy City's remains is unknown. Now, the clock's ticking until our first ever run-in with the Flood. Only 507 years to go, to be precise. So today, to try and prepare you for that eventuality, we're going to break down the lore behind every single Flood form in the Halo universe, from small to big to massive, and even one that's quite literally woven into the fabric of existence. This is the ultimate Flood survival guide. So we're going to start right at the bottom and begin with the infector forms, because, I mean, come on, what are the Flood if they can't infect? Starting out with the Flood supercell, the core building block of literally anything Flood. Referred to as thinking muscle by the Foreigners, the supercell is similar to neurons or glial cells in its structure, and is the absolute origin of every Flood form in existence. It's also the reason that Flood biomass forms, and it can be configured into any organ or muscle necessary to continue the biological and organizational growth of the parasite. Now, this ranges from anything from, say, a whip on a combat form, or the construction of a hive, to the consumption of an entire environment, and even constructing a planet-sized gravemind. During the infection process, the supercell is implanted into the host, where it then interfaces with their cells before analyzing, metabolizing, and eventually breaking them down before then reassembling them into more Flood cells that mimic the function of the target cells, thus completing the host transformation into a Flood form. Flood spores are the most commonly found vector for the infection, and they take the form of supercells encysted within a chitinous outer layer. They're airborne and can remain dormant for hundreds of years, adapting to their environment to survive and only reactivating when they come into contact with some kind of surface, sentient or non-sentient, organic or inorganic, where the infection process then begins. Upon coming into contact with a victim in any way, even something as minor as skin contact, any existing biomass is turned into supercell surrogates, and while the victim is still alive, it violently molds them into a crash of egg-like incubators to gestate infection forms that are designed specifically for the environment that the spores have adapted to. Although victims can be turned into combat forms by spores, recent lore has kind of changed their focus from creating combat forms solely to more specifically turning hosts into infection form incubators. The Flood tadpole is a rather interesting one because despite being introduced all the way back in Halo 2, we still know next to nothing about them. So, in a very old Bungie.net post, they kind of alluded to the idea of them possibly being infection forms in an earlier stage of development, but that's never been hard confirmed. Regardless, they're the only water-based Flood forms that we know of right now, which opens the door to the possibility of them maybe even being able to infect water in kind of a similar way to how spores infect the air, but as of now, that's just conjecture. The most infamous and feared Flood infection form is, well, the infection form itself. Typically roaming in large swarms, the infection forms are fast, agile, and also surprisingly large, on average between 90 and 130 centimeters tall. Pretty terrifying. Now, these creepy little creatures specialize in the creation of combat forms. Using these sensulum-like appendages that are on the end of their tentacles that act as their sensory antennas, they lock in on a host and aim straight for their spinal cord. Using their tentacles, they break through any armor and clothing before piercing the skin and tapping into the spinal cord, unleashing an attack on the host's nervous system and rewriting the neural pathways of their brain, which it manages by forcing a resonant frequency match between its own neural signals and the host's. And once that's complete, the infection form has gained full control of the host's body. However, simultaneously, the infection form also secretes Flood supercells inside the host, which convert their cells to Flood cells and begin the physical transformation from healthy host to combat form, which also inadvertently acts as something of an insurance policy. So, because the supercells are secreted immediately upon contact with the spine, if the infection form is killed before it can fully commandeer the host's body, then they'll still begin mutating into a Flood form thanks to the supercells that are rapidly consuming and reassembling their cells. But if the infection form isn't killed and remains intact, it will then burrow through the host's insides, pushing aside any organs and bones to nest in their chest, where it will then control the combat form until it's either dead, or its body is destroyed or severely damaged, upon which the infection form can simply just hop out of the destroyed body and find a new one to inhabit, or maybe even a new host to infect. The Cedar is a relatively new variant of airborne infection form that was first spotted during the second outbreak on the Ark in Halo Wars 2. As the physical embodiment of the Flood's ability to diversify, the Cedar forms hunt down potential biomass over land, air, and even water. Their lighter-than-air makeup makes them incredibly fast, and upon the creation of a hive, they're created en masse to voraciously spread out in search of creatures to infect or feed upon. When they find a victim, they launch themselves at them in a very similar vein to the infection forms, causing them to undergo the typical infection process. Not even vehicles and their crews are immune to Cedar infection. Cedars also tend to gather in immense swarms, creating dense living barriers in the sky to protect the Flood from aerial assaults. And the final infector form is the dispersal pod, living drop pods, grown to be disposable containers for combat forms, pure forms, and spore clouds. The dispersal pods protect the forms inside during orbital insertions, typically from infected ships. However, they can also be launched from ground-based hives like a form of living artillery to infect areas or holdouts from afar. Upon impact with the ground, they burst open to reveal their infected cargo, unscathed and ready to infect. Moving on to the carrier forms, a rather iconic subsect of Flood. And starting out, let's take a look at the eponymous carrier form. These bulbous, waddling Flood forms are the main way that infection forms are spread across the battlefield. Created from a mixture of damaged combat forms, infected creatures with damaged bodies, or hosts that simply aren't suitable to become a combat form, the carrier forms are a prime example of the Flood using whatever it can get its hands on, and as such, there are two distinct variants of them. There are converted carrier forms, which are made from hosts with very little offensive potential that are turned into carrier forms immediately upon infection, and then demoted carrier forms, which are made from those combat forms that have been damaged beyond utility. These otherwise useless biomass entities are turned into mobile infection form incubation vessels, filled with violent gases that eventually cause them to burst, not only causing immense damage to anyone or anything caught in the blast radius, but also releasing all of their newborn infection forms, setting them free to find a fresh host to infect. Then there's the spawner form, which was also only seen during Halo Wars 2's outbreak on the Ark. These things are a much larger and much heavier form of carrier that, although still surprisingly mobile, typically stay on the backlines of a Flood's assault, where they spew out infection forms to swarm the battlefield with infectors. Spawners are often seen very far from their birth hives, establishing new reservoirs of Flood in extremely remote areas, and play a key role in the Flood's expansion by ensuring its infection vectors are spread as far as possible. The bomber form has only ever been spotted once, during the rather mysterious outbreak on the shield world of Trove in Halo Wars 1. Now this thing bears a rather ghastly look, a haunting visage, its mouth flesh-bound and long finger-like tendrils. The creature that it originates from was something of a pseudocephalopod that traversed the air using gas bladders, a trait which the Flood have now commandeered to create an airborne carrier form. Just like the regular carrier form, the bomber incubates infection forms within its body, which it then releases by dropping blisters packed full of them down onto the battlefield. And then the final, at least known carrier form is the Burster, a subterranean carrier form that burrows underground and erupts beneath its victims, exploding to release spores and infection forms. Typically, the Burster is only really seen within Flood Blightlands, where it patrols beneath the ground to jump any uninfected intruders. However, it's not entirely unheard of for them to roam outside of the Blightlands as well. Next up we have combat forms, which are of course the main fighting form of any Flood outbreak. Now, I've split these forms into two separate categories: conventional combat forms and unconventional combat forms. Starting out with the conventional combat forms, these are the most common kinds of combat form, made from intelligent species such as humans, elites, brutes, grunts, intelligent and grunt in the same sentence, good one, jackals, foreigners, etc, etc. So, combat forms are infected hosts controlled by an infection form. The host undergoes a variety of mutations, primarily offensive in nature upon infection, growing whips, claws, bludgeons, or even in some rarer cases, infection form incubation mounds on their back. Mutations are entirely situational and are dictated by the infection form in control that, using the supercell, can also repair damaged parts of the body by generating biomass or simply just growing new limbs on the fly. Their bodies are also covered in spore-filled polyps that, upon sustaining any kind of damage, explode, releasing spores into the air, spreading the infection even further. Their internal organs are also replaced with supercell growths that hold spores in suspension, which is what that kind of sticky green flood blood is that comes out of a combat form whenever you destroy them. Now, this extends to the discarded limbs and biomatter of the combat forms as well. Even carcasses and severed limbs on the ground can act as vessels for the infection. The only way to sufficiently counter this is through the use of fire or any source of extreme heat, like plasma, for example. Combat forms have also been known to infect a host by biting them as well, traditional zombie style, presumably implanting the supercell within a victim via its teeth, its saliva, its flood blood, or kind of any general supercell-rich bodily fluids. And by extension, this also means that they can infect via scratching or really just any kind of wound in general. As long as biomatter that contains the supercell makes contact with the host, infection is all but guaranteed. However, despite the litany of mutations that a host undergoes, many of their organs, their limbs, and their sensory organs are actually kept intact to allow them to still hold weapons, drive vehicles, pilot ships, and still function relatively normally. So, upon succumbing to the flood, the infection form sifts through the host's brain for any kind of knowledge or memories about such things, which it then adds to the flood hive mind almost like a parasite-wide database, giving all other combat forms similar abilities. Think about it, if a flood had no hands, how the hell could it drive a warthog? Much later in the flood's evolution, the Gravemind can even use combat forms as a mobile vector of the logic plague, speaking directly through them to transmit the plague, corrupting AIs, systems, networks, and even sending biological entities insane. Despite being the main flood form, so to speak, combat forms are some of the most capable and versatile infected within the entire hive mind, and should never be underestimated. Moving over to the unconventional combat forms, there are only two forms that fall into this category, and I've separated them because the unconventional forms, as the name implies, don't really function like any of the typical combat forms that we know and love, and they've also only ever been spotted during one outbreak, the one in the Shield world in Halo Wars 1. The first one is the Flood Swarm, which is a rather interesting creature. So the host is a strange predatory avian creature that, while large, is rather thin and bony, but has sufficient calcium reserves and a resilient enough neurosystem to be infected. However, to prevent over-consuming what little biomass this creature has, the parasite limits supercell growths on the swarm, which is why their bodies look rather intact, to say that they're combat forms. As you can see, there isn't really much biomass to reuse on these guys. Now, as the name implies, the swarm combat forms typically hunt in swarms, launching coordinated and highly sophisticated attacks from above, firing barbed, infectious projectiles, and even swooping down to use their razor-sharp talons and teeth to gouge their prey into pieces. It's unknown whether their talons and teeth can spread the infection, but given that irregular combat forms bite or scratch absolutely can, then I'd hazard a guess that the swarms can as well. And then there's the Thrasher, which is something of an anomaly of a combat form, because apparently many non-sapient animals that are possessed by an infection form actually aren't capable of being fully exploited by the Flood. However, the Thrasher is an exception. Thanks to its more than sufficient neurocomplexity, the Thrasher creature is able to be infected and controlled even in the early stages of an outbreak, when the Flood are nowhere near their apex intelligence. That said though, the Thrasher combat form is still a relatively simple weapon for the Flood. With its limited intellect, they rely primarily on its hulking size, along with its concealed whip-like barbed tentacles and toothy maws that gorge on flesh to fuel its rampage. Now, although this thing bears a rather striking resemblance to the tank pure form, this is merely a coincidence thanks to its raw mass and also its role as an immensely strong, bulky, and aggressive flood form. And speaking of pure forms, when these bad boys start popping up, yeah, that outbreak is getting pretty serious. Pure forms are only created once the Flood have reached the second stage of their evolution, the Coordinator stage, a prerequisite for which is the creation of a Gravemind. As the name implies, the pure forms require no uninfected host to be created. Rather, they're generated from scratch by the Flood supercell and the infected biomass of all their defeated foes. These forms are not only highly lethal, but thanks to the nature of their creation, are also far more specialized than any other Flood forms. And when it comes to specialization, nothing excels like the Shifter pure form. The Shifter is the underlying pure form that we saw in Halo 3, and as the name implies, can shapeshift between 3 different forms depending on the situation. The creature itself is an undifferentiated mass of supercells that are typically found near newly established hives. It synergizes with its native-born environment to protect the lair from any threat until larger pure forms can be created, and it achieves this by shapeshifting into one of 3 possible forms. Firstly, the Stalker form. The Stalker specializes in mobility and is used by the Shifter to relocate or flee from danger. It's fast, nimble, can leap great heights, and can even walk on any surface at any gradient, and its body is extremely low profile and flat to the ground to make up for its rather weak constitution. However, despite the Stalker only ever really being used by the Shifter to reposition, it still has razor-sharp claws that give it some means of defense if needed. The Ranger is the second form of the Shifter, and it's the reason why the Stalker can run up walls and across ceilings. The Ranger is typically found mounted high up on a wall or even upside down on a roof, far from the reach of any potential threats. It sits on 2 hind legs with a protruding forelimb that almost acts like a tripod to stabilize itself as it fires a barrage of calcified spikes from its pod-like body. Now, it's unknown whether these spikes have the ability to infect, like, say, the Swarm's projectiles, for example, but regardless, they are still hyper-lethal. Although the range form is entirely immobile, it can coil its abdomen up to protect its face until the coast is clear, and it's surprisingly resilient while doing so. And then there's the Tank form, a surprisingly mobile and startlingly fast hulking beast of a pure form. The Tank form is pure mass and strength. It's extremely tough to bring down, and has a huge scythe-like arm which it uses to bludgeon any threats to the hive with ease. It can also use this arm to charge much faster than its regular movement speed when it sees a threat, and also to cover its face should it start sustaining too much damage, and trust me, there are very few rounds that can penetrate its rock-solid arm. When it's on the backline, or surrounded by many other Flood forms, the tank can also spew fresh infection forms from its mouth that were presumably incubated within itself, although the logistics of how that works with the Shifter's constantly changing form is a mystery. Moving on from the Shifter, we have the Infestor pure form, which is one of the few pure forms that was only ever seen once during the outbreak on the Ark, and it's yet again another highly specialized form, designed solely to crack open vehicles and infect their crew. A viciously aggressive pure form, the Infestor will launch itself at a vehicle at rapid speed, grabbing onto it with its tentacles and boring through the hull to infect the crew inside. However, these creatures are purpose-built bioweapons, and so, once the vehicle and its crew are infected, it just collapses in a dying heap, releasing a cloud of spores. The Infestor is typically employed by the Flood in cases of extreme enemy vehicle presence to force them to approach the parasite on foot, which, as we know, is a rather foolish endeavor. The Helion is a very rarely seen Flood siege engine, a pure form designed for the mass assault of enemy holdouts or bases. This thing is a bitter monument of pulsating supercells, vaguely reflecting the majesty of a Gravemind, although unlike a Gravemind, the Helion doesn't act as a leader for the Flood, but rather as a mobile hive and a means of sieging outposts. They incubate and shelter massive numbers of smaller Flood, and can rend and refashion their flesh and bone, almost like the Shifter, to become a living weapon, aimed at any defenses that seek to halt the parasite spread. And the final known pure form is the Gaunt, which is one of the 2 known Flood assassin forms. The Gaunt is a combat multiplier for the Flood that leverages the hive mind's intellect to serve as an elite assassin and an independent agent of the parasite. Typically stalking their prey from the shadows, accompanied by large hordes of infection forms, the Gaunt rarely approaches a fight when the odds are even. They are incredibly agile and fast, able to coil up into a ball and roll across the battlefield, and then use their long whip-like arms to both traverse the environment and also to subdue enemies. Their rather unique approach to battle makes them the perfect form for subduing key enemies, allowing their body, their mind, and all their knowledge within to be absorbed into the Flood's collective consciousness, revealing hidden strategies and their countermeasure plans. The Gaunt is rarely seen, but even more rarely survived. And finally, we come to the Keymind forms, the absolute apex of Flood evolution and intelligence. As the infection spreads, the Flood harvest complex neural tissue to weave into biological networks, bolstering their collective intelligence and allowing synchronization between disparate hordes and outbreaks. And the Keymind forms are the physical embodiment of this achievement. Their presence typically indicates that most, if not all, local animal life and sentient hosts have been consumed or infected. Their size, shape, and complexity vary radically, from infected corpses that are crudely grafted together to entities that consume entire planets, and they all provide varying degrees of leadership and coordination to local inferior Flood forms. Now, the Flood Juggernaut is arguably one of, if not the most iconic Keymind forms in all of Halo. And you know, if things had gone differently, they might have been the first Keymind that we ever encountered. The Flood Juggernauts are field commanders that make use of multiple infected host minds to study enemy countermeasures and containment protocols, and then adjust the Flood's local strategy accordingly. Although they synchronize nearby Flood and relay information between distant hordes, they are still subservient though to greater coordinating entities such as grave mines. In terms of the Juggernaut's combat capabilities, although their role as Keymines means that they do try and avoid combat where possible, that sure as hell doesn't mean they aren't built for it. They have incredible mobility, able to jump large heights and even scale vertical walls using their tentacles, which are also their main means of attack. They are extremely strong, able to destroy vehicles, launch objects, crush just about any biological in their way, and even shield their face with them when coming under heavy fire. Even though they do try and avoid combat, thanks to the Juggernaut's raw intelligence, they are more than aware of their high-value status on the battlefield, which is a trait that they often leverage to lure enemies into traps, preying on their victims' false hope of taking out a mythical, hulking Flood Juggernaut. The Flood Abomination is such a powerful, significant Keymind form that the Parasite often use it as a stand-in for an entire hive. Referred to specifically as a Keymind war form, the Abominations are massive, towering creatures that bring order and direction to lesser Flood, turning feral parasites into a cunning and efficient collective. When a hive cannot be established and the Flood have to stay on the move, Abominations are employed as a stand-in for the coordination that a hive produces. But despite its role as a Keymind, its subdesignation of a war form indicates its penchant for battle. Its enormous size, strength, and staggering resilience allow it to lead any number of lesser Flood into battle with ease. Its tendrils are so great that they can reduce any kind of fortification or mechanized defense to ashes, and as for organic enemies, well, a fine paste is all the Abomination leaves behind. These hulking monstrosities are often used to drive enemies out of otherwise impenetrable fortresses, often sending them directly into hordes of lesser forms to be infected or consumed. The Flood Blightstalker is an especially unique Keymind, one that, to the best of our knowledge, has never been spotted in the flesh, or rather, anyone who has spotted it in the flesh has never lived to tell the tale. The Blightstalker is the other assassin-style Flood form alongside the Gaunt. These things are terrifying hunters, large, fast, aggressive predators that ravenously scour the border regions of Blightlands from the shadows, seeking out any biomass that dares to venture within. As Keymind forms, the Blightstalkers act as coordinators in environments where no high-intelligence hosts are available for infection, and provide a local command node for any flood forces in the area. They are without a doubt the most ravenous of all the Keymind forms, and quite possibly the most violent as well, and they make the invasion of a Blightland an almost impossible task. The Proto-Gravemind is one of the earliest Keymind forms of a flood outbreak, and it's the earliest stage of the most terrifying entity in all the Flood's repertoire. It doesn't really look like a creature, more like an amorphous blob of biomass, and, well, that's kind of by design. As soon as an outbreak begins, the Flood seek to evolve by consuming biomass and the intelligence that said biomass harbours, and the Proto-Gravemind is the end goal of this consumption. Composed of infected individuals and sometimes even machinery, all the entities that are mashed together to create this thing harbour intelligence and knowledge of great importance to the Flood, and form the basis of its first coordinating form. Using this newfound information, the Proto-Gravemind forms immense networks which exponentially extend the Flood's collective intelligence, allowing communication and interaction across vast distances using neural physics, but we'll touch more on neural physics and all that esoteric stuff in a minute. As an outbreak continues to spread and more important biomass is added to the Proto-Gravemind, its size of course increases. Now, the one that we saw in Halo Combat Evolved, which Captain Keyes formed the basis of, was actually rather early in its development, whereas the one that we saw during the Ark outbreak was gigantic, much more advanced and much closer to evolving into a full Gravemind. If dealt with rather early on, then a Proto-Gravemind doesn't really pose too much of a threat, because the Flood will remain in the feral stage of evolution, and thus will remain rather unintelligent and uncoordinated. However, if an outbreak is left unchecked, and the Flood are left to continue compiling biomass into its central intelligence, then the Proto evolves into a full Gravemind, the results of which are terrifying. The Gravemind represents the absolute apex of Flood evolution and intelligence. A theoretically infinite number of Graveminds can exist at once, but they're all connected to the same collective consciousness, the Flood Hivemind, and they also all share the same personality, so to speak, the personality of the Primordial, the last precursor and the first Gravemind. Now, the most terrifying thing about this is that that personality and all of its knowledge that span over 100,000, if not millions, billions of years, can never be destroyed. So, because the Flood are precursor in nature, they abide by their previous forms' esoteric philosophical concepts such as living time and neural physics, the latter essentially stating that everything in existence is a living being of sorts, one far beyond our comprehension, which means that the Primordial's consciousness and all of its knowledge are quite literally woven into the fabric of existence, and thus the only way to destroy them, so to speak, is by destroying existence itself. Quite Lovecraftian. The goal of a Gravemind is rather simple: total galactic consumption, unity through assimilation, and ultimately, sweetness. Thanks to its raw intelligence, the Gravemind can coordinate and direct flood forms from seemingly infinite distances, literally all across the galaxy. Because it's in tune with precursor concepts like neural physics, it can also open portals seemingly at will, which it did to jump High Charity from Mars to the Ark in Halo 3. In terms of their physical bodies, Graveminds are always massive, but they can vary from the size that we saw in Halo 2, for example, which was roughly the size of a Halo's control room, to quite literally consuming entire planets, which we're going to touch on briefly in a minute. They have an unfathomable amount of tentacles, all extremely large and extremely strong, and to speak, it uses various mouths lined with rows of sharp teeth. It can also use combat forms as vessels for its words, to inflict psychological torture on its enemies, alongside all the other kinds of torture that the Flood inflict. And also, like I mentioned earlier, it can use them to transmit the logic plague from afar in the latter stages of evolution, allowing it to infect AIs, networks, and send sentient individuals insane remotely from anywhere in the galaxy. Now, the Keymind form is something that I want to briefly touch on as like an addendum to the Gravemind section, even though it technically isn't canon anymore, at least in a way. So, when 343 brought the Flood back in Halo Wars 2, they made a load of retroactive changes to Flood lore, including introducing the concept of Keymines as I've described them in this video. But prior to these changes, the concept of a Keymind was actually its own entire form. It was the next evolutionary stage of a Gravemind. So before these changes, it used to go Proto-Gravemind, Gravemind, Keymind. But what was a Keymind? Well, it's very simple. A Keymind was a Gravemind that had grown so large it was now the size of an entire planet. Now, these forms still absolutely exist, but the difference is that now they're just referred to as planet-sized Graveminds, whereas before, they were their own entirely separate form, very clearly distinguished from the Gravemind. And I gotta be honest, I actually really wish that was still the case. Graveminds now are entirely dynamic in their size. They can be the size that we saw the one in Halo 2 as, or they can quite literally be the size of an entire planet. But the latter before was reserved solely for the Keymind form, which was then, at that point, deemed the absolute apex of Flood evolution. So Keyminds absolutely still exist now, they're just basically big Graveminds as opposed to being their own forms. And finally, we get to the one known entity that, although technically only 50% Flood, is still deemed more advanced than a Gravemind: the Primordial. Now, the Primordial isn't a type of Flood, but rather is a single individual entity, the last precursor and the first Gravemind. It was the last surviving precursor of their previous forms that, over time, much like the dust that created the Flood, mutated and corrupted, eventually no longer resembling the precursors in any way physically. It arrived in the galaxy a million years after the Forerunners' extermination of the precursors in 9 million BC, and was rumoured to have been the entity that brought the ships containing the powder that would create the Flood into our galaxy. Because of its connections to the precursors, Halo's god species, the Primordial was quite possibly the most intelligent being ever encountered in Halo, harbouring likely billions of years of knowledge courtesy of the transcendent precursors who existed on a plane of existence far beyond our comprehension. The latter years of the Primordial's life were spent in captivity, firstly by the hand of the ancient humans, who held it in stasis on the planet of Cheram Hakor, which was once their capital world. During its time under ancient human supervision, the words that the Primordial divulged to its captors about the true nature of the Flood was seen as so horrific and so mortifying that those in its presence chose to, how do I put this that's very YouTube safe, check in for the long nap instead of continuing on, if you can catch my drift. However, it was eventually freed by accident by the Forerunners, only to then be recaptured and held on Installation 07 by them, where it underwent a 43-year-long interrogation by Mendicant Bias. Now, Mendicant Bias was the most intelligent AI the Forerunners had ever created, that was also in charge of their entire war effort against the Flood, and during its interrogation with the Primordial, it was able to infect the AI with the Logic Plague, using its carefully crafted words and horrifying truths to convince Mendicant that the Flood were, in fact, the next step in galactic evolution, and that its creators were standing in the way of that. It was also responsible for infecting the creator of the Halo Rings, Faber the Master Builder, with the Logic Plague as well, where it oversaw his sick and twisted experiments on captive humans. Eventually though, this time on Zeta Halo would come to an end when the ring was recaptured along with the Primordial itself, where it was then placed in a time acceleration chamber and, at least physically, was destroyed for good. But ethereally, as per neural physics, the Primordial's consciousness and knowledge live on, woven into the very fabric of existence for all future Graveminds to inherit. Not even the heat death of the universe would destroy the primordial. It exists for as long as existence itself is a thing. One of the most horrifying things about the Flood is just how little we actually know about them. As they spread throughout the galaxy 100 millennia ago, their infected numbers became so great and so widespread that the Foreigners couldn't possibly catalogue every single form. Some Foreigner tacticians were even forced into the realm of theoretical research to try and understand the parasite, and so their documentation was minimal at best. For every known piece of information about the Flood, there exist 1,000 unknowns. For every encountered Flood form, 1,000 unencountered forms. But today, we change that. Today, we're taking a look at some of the Flood forms that we know exist, but that we've never actually encountered. And you know what? Let's start off with a form that is frankly so horrifying that I hope for all of our sakes, we never actually do encounter it. That was of course a joke. I really want to encounter this in a game. Pretty please. The Blightstalker. The Blightstalker is a terrifying, highly specialised, ravenous pure form that scours Flood Blightlands, while also acting as a coordinating form for local infected, should no central intelligence like a proto or regular Gravemind be present, or should no high intelligence host be available for infection either. The Blightstalkers are large, aggressive predators that haunt the shadows of Blightlands to seek out elusive sources of biomass while acting as a command node for local infected. They're fast and extremely powerful, presumably moving on all fours and attacking with either their hooked forelimbs, their sharp teeth, or their chin-mounted tusk, with all forms of attack also presumably acting as vectors for spreading the Flood supercell, and thus spreading the Flood infection itself. Any who venture into a Blightland risk being hunted by these pure form stalkers, who represent one of the most unquestionably terrifying and ravenous embodiments of the Keymine Flood command form. Thankfully, the Blightstalker is yet to be encountered, let alone engaged by humanity, thanks to our relative lack of experience when it comes to full-blown Blightlands. However, should we ever have to engage them, then, well, heavily armoured troops and equipment with the ability to both disable and incapacitate would be a necessity for bringing down the Blightstalker. Now, on the topic of keymines, this next form kind of exists in canon limbo. So it used to have a specific name and kind of a specific outline, but then 343 made some partially questionable changes to Flood lore with Awakening the Nightmare, which kind of caused this form to almost fall through the cracks of Halo lore. We've also never encountered it at all, at least as far as we're aware, which kind of just adds to its mystery. This entity is the original definition of a keymind. So, currently, a keymind is basically an umbrella term that's used to denote a Flood form that coordinates and commands local Flood forces, but prior to the canon change, a keymind was actually the name of a specific Flood entity. It was the next step in the Flood's evolution past a Gravemind entity so large that it consumed an entire planet. Now, these keymines, these planet-sized entities, only existed, at least to our knowledge, in the final era of the Foreigner Flood War. Their size and complexity was unprecedented. The amalgamation of an entire planet's ecosystem and God knows how many species being consumed and converted into the keymine form. Thanks to their size and makeup, these keymines were not just exceptionally large, but extraordinarily intelligent as well. Their tactical planning was bar none, able to outmatch even the most intelligent of Metarch-class AIs, which, if you don't know, are the most intelligent classification of AIs in galactic history. They were able to assume complete control of infected regions of space, and able to send infected battle fleets through an unprecedented number of slipspace portals using technology that was unfamiliar to the Foreigners, likely ancient precursor neural physics. This same technology was also able to block Foreigner reinforcements from reaching the front lines, likely by intercepting or even blocking their faster-than-light travel. Fleets that were blocked by keymines showed signs of extreme reconciliation failure, which indicated catastrophic failures with slipspace travel. However, most alarming about the Keymines was their ability to reawaken precursor artifacts. Grand, ancient, stellar structures and concepts such as orbital ribbons, star roads, planetary fortresses, and citadels. Thanks to the sheer danger of even coming close to a Keymine-infested region of space, foreign defense forces proved inadequate to investigate and confirm these reawakenings, but the mere fact that Keymines were able to harness the power of the precursors, their former selves, and, don't forget, the literal gods of creation in the Halo universe, is frankly terrifying. The only thing the Foreigners were able to ascertain about the Keymines in the final years of the war was that they were spread galaxy-wide. Now, post-lore change, these Keymines, these planet-sized forms, are simply referred to as grave mines. They're just considered to be much larger grave mines that have consumed an entire planet. Now, call me old school here, right? But I actually really prefer the old version of Keymine over the new one. I mean, I find it both equal parts intriguing and frankly terrifying that there exists a form beyond the Gravemind. Like, the Flood's evolutionary trail doesn't just come to a dead stop at Gravemind. There actually exists a form that's even larger, even more powerful, and even more intelligent than a Gravemind. I don't know. I just think that's really, really damn cool. I'll tell you, nowadays, the only way for you to possibly reach this kind of post-Gravemind level of intelligence is by subscribing right now, and whilst you're doing that, make sure you follow me on Twitter to be assimilated into the HiddenXperia hive mind. Hey, come on, I don't make the rules here, right? It's the 10 million year old parasitic, omnipotent god that's speaking through me using ancient concepts of philosophy and physics that's creating these rules, and I mean, do you expect me to ignore those rules? Come on. Speaking of large flood entities, one that we can thank our lucky stars we've never encountered is the Helion. A gigantic, bitter monument of pulsating flood supercells that vaguely reflect the majesty of a gravemind and are used as siege engines during the Flood's efforts to overwhelm and consume planetary holdouts and defenses. Now, the Helion isn't just a Keymine form, but rather a siege machine and a mobile hive as well, able to incubate and shelter large numbers of smaller parasites, from infection forms to combat forms and maybe even more pure forms as well. The organism can also re-render and refashion its own flesh and bone into a living weapon, aimed at any defenses the Flood wish to overrun and consume. If you're holding out at an important location and you just happen to see a Helion beginning to eclipse the horizon, maybe it's time to run. Another gigantic Keymine form that we're yet to encounter in the biomass is the Gaunt. Now, although the only picture we have of the Gaunt is just an abomination, this apparently isn't actually what they look like, at least all the time. The way that it's described in the encyclopedia is frankly strange, so I'm just going to run with it. The Flood Gaunt is a combat multiplier for the Flood's strategic advance. It leverages their collective consciousness to serve as an elite Flood assassin and independent agent, seemingly possessing some degree of free will separate from that of the hive mind. It's a fast, agile, and incredibly mobile form, able to use its arm whips as both weapons and tools to traverse the environment. Think of the Gaunt as a Flood hunter. Rarely do they actually engage targets when the odds are even. They prefer to stalk from the shadows, accompanied by vast hordes of infection forms before ambushing their target. They're able to tactically subdue key enemies and HVTs as well, absorbing them into the Flood's hive mind to reveal hidden strategies and to glean their enemies' Flood countermeasure plans. Thanks to the Gaunt's unrelenting speed and savagery, few are said to have ever survived an encounter with one of these monsters. So, I want to cover a rather large number of unencountered Flood forms in one go here, right? So, these are all forms that have no name or identification of any sort whatsoever, and also, believe it or not, these are Flood forms that nobody on YouTube, and I mean nobody, myself included, has ever covered before. These are the Flood forms that were present in Halo Legends Origins that the Foreigners fought in the final days of their war with the Parasite. So, firstly, we have these big floaty things. Now, to me, these things look like either airborne infection forms, so maybe a derivative of the Cedar Infector, or massive Flood spores. This thing here honestly looks like some kind of Helion, maybe a smaller than usual one. It's a weird kind of form, this is. In the room with Mendicant Bias, the form in the bottom right hand corner looks kind of similar to Halo 3's cut transport form, but a lot smaller. Then again, it could just be artistic liberty, and this thing could just be a stalker form. In the Narrows-like construction, we have what looks to be a 4-legged carrier form, moving with the other carrier forms. Now, interestingly, this form is actually one of Bungie's earliest designs ever for the carrier form, so I guess this actually confirms that OG design for the carrier form is actually canon. Likely as an alternate carrier form similar to the subterranean Flood Burster from Halo Wars 2. A lot of the forms in this next room look like variants of either the Blister or the Incubator. The Flood isn't obviously a perfect species. No two Flood forms, regardless of what they are, will ever look the same, so, you know, it wouldn't surprise me if these were just different looking versions of the same entity. The great mounds of biomass on the Forerunner constructs are likely the beginnings of Flood colonies, Flood nests, or dens that we saw in Halo Wars, you know, given their size and also the fact that they're infesting and consuming structures. This massive entity just looks like a pretty standard colony, again from Halo Wars. Now, this large stretchy thing here looks like either a large clump of just kind of miscellaneous biomass, or, more likely, a proto-gravemind, given how well it's being guarded by a litany of other forms. If you wanted to get super theoretical, it could also even be our only other look at a Helion as well. I mean, it's massive, and it's consuming a structure, and it's also secreting tons of infection forms when the Foreigners get near, so, you know, the description would definitely fit. Here we get an in-depth look at the inner workings of a hive that's packed with spores and various kinds of infector forms, and also biological-looking structures made from Flood biomass. Pretty rancid looking, to be honest. There's a weird kind of semi-armoured looking form here on the left, and as we move through, we get a look at a bunch of strange forms that almost look like they're worshipping what will eventually become a gravemind. Now, some of these forms look like alternate carrier forms, some are also combat forms, but the others? God knows, honestly. That guy with the big green head kind of looks like an Ent, and the others, I can't even begin to describe or categorize these things. So, yeah, there's no names for any of these forms at all, but, you know, I thought they were worth pointing out considering there's a ton of Flood forms in Origins Part 1 that we've never encountered before, and like I said, never even talked about before, so I figured this was the time to do it. Okay, with this next one, I'm gonna kind of bend the rules. Not break, just bend them a little bit to cover one specific Flood form. Now, we've never encountered it in a main Halo game or even a conventional spin-off game. We have encountered it, technically, in an arcade game, but, you know, it's just such an illustrious pure form that I had to cover it. The Juggernaut. The Flood Juggernaut is an iconic Keymind pure form that functions as a field commander for the Parasite, making use of multiple infected host minds to bend their intellect toward the analysis of enemy countermeasures and containment protocols, adjusting the local Flood strategy accordingly. They can also synchronize nearby parasites and relay information between distant Flood hordes, thanks to them being, of course, a Keymind entity, but they are still subservient to greater coordinating entities like Gravemind. Physically, the Juggernaut is large, powerful, and incredibly mobile despite that, able to use its long tentacled arms to not only engage enemies with great force, but also to scale structures and avoid combat, which actually it often prefers to do so it can fulfill its role as a parasitic field commander. That said, despite their affinity for actually avoiding combat, they do seem to be aware of their high-value status on the battlefield, and often use that status to draw enemies into traps and ambushes. You know, one of these days, I swear to God, we're actually going to finally fight a Juggernaut in an FPS game. Yeah, we had the Abomination in Halo Wars 2, and it was cool and all, but I want to fight the real deal. I want to kill the real deal with my own hands. Okay, so it's time to move into some more uncertain territory. Now, the next few Flood forms that I'm going to cover were cut from their respective games, however, I've picked them for this video for a reason. I want to talk about them for two reasons, actually. Firstly, they're all Flood forms that could realistically exist within the parameters of the Flood that we know are in place in the universe. And 2, 343 have a real habit nowadays of going back and canonizing loads of cut content. I mean, look at all the new additions to the Covenant Fringe, for example, and hell, even the Juggernauts are canon now, despite never actually being in any kind of main game. They were canon even before Fireteam Raven. So, you know, consider this partly me wanting to talk about other cool Flood forms, and also a way for me to future-proof this video in the, I would say, likely outcome that a lot of these Flood forms do end up getting canonized somewhere down the road. So, just as the Forerunners were forced to do in the final days of their war with the Flood, let's step into the realm of theoretical Flood lore. The first cut Flood form is the Flood Banger. Now, these were meant to be a variant of Infection form in Halo 3 that did serious explosive damage upon impact. Now, of course, regular Infection forms already do this, but by the looks of it, the Flood Bangers were gonna ramp the damage up quite a bit. The only trace of them left over in Halo 3 is a variant of Infection form that does a mini plasma grenade explosion when popped, so, you know, that should give you an idea as to how much damage the Bangers were actually going to do. I can imagine these things being an almost evolved version of the Infection form that could only exist once the Flood reached, like, I don't know, the coordinated stage, for example. Maybe intended to still infect their target host, but also with the added failsafe of releasing spores and doing more damage if destroyed. Who knows though. And then finally, we have 3 pure forms that were cut from Halo 3. The Stealth form, the Infector form, and the Transport form. Now, starting off with, at least to me, what is probably the coolest one, the Stealth form. And this thing was gonna be, yeah, you guessed it, a Flood form that prioritized stealth over head-first engagements. What a shock. Now, no actual lore is known about the Stealth form, but we can do some deductions based on literally like the 2 pictures that we have of it. Clearly, it's a heavily tentacle-based Flood form, and by the looks of its concept art and of course the name, it was going to be some sort of like assassin-type pure form that relied on its tentacles and also its sharpened appendages to assassinate targets. You know, in hindsight, maybe 343 took some inspiration from the Stealth form when designing the Gaunt, and maybe also the Blightstalker as well. See, this is what I was talking about. A lot of old concepts get brought back to the forefront, either indirectly like this, or directly like the Juggernaut. Next, the Infector form, which was resurrected in immaculate blur-like quality by Halo VFX in its Charity Fall series. Seriously, what a beauty. Go and watch that if you haven't. Now, this thing was basically meant to be Halo's first truly anti-vehicle Flood form, but it didn't exactly achieve that through any conventional means, which I really like. It wasn't some massive hulking juggernaut-like beast, but rather a smaller, if I had to guess, roughly mongoose-sized 3-legged creature. It was classed as an infection/attack pure form, and it had regenerating spore projectiles in its body that it had launched at vehicles to infect them. Once these projectiles attached to a vehicle, they'd become Flood biolimbs that would spread biomass throughout the vehicle to pilot it and operate its turrets. If the projectile missed the vehicle and landed on the ground instead, it'd use a large tentacle to sense biomass around it, and if it sensed anything, it'd quickly latch onto it and reel itself towards it. Once connected to the target, it would embed itself in and begin the infection process by converting controllable parts of the vehicle to biomass, and then once enough of this biomass is established, the vehicle becomes linked to the Graveminer's consciousness and is controlled by the Flood, by the looks of it, without any kind of pilot. You know, the concept of almost like Flood ghost vehicles sounds really cool. And then finally we have the Flood Transport form, which actually was supposed to be a huge pure form, and although it looks really similar to the Stalker, I can assure you this thing functions nothing like the Stalker. It was also known as the Flood Sweeper, and it was basically a huge triple-jointed quadruped that walked on its arms and would consume any biomass it could find. Within its body, it'd recycle this biomass, which would cause the biomass reprocessor on its back to start glowing. This reprocessor caused rapid growth of Flood embryos, which created a cocoon that the transporter would then spit out, and that cocoon would then burst open on the battlefield to reveal a combat form. Up to 6 combat forms could also ride on the back of the transporter into battle as well, so, you know, in a way, the transport form was kind of like a Flood APC. It's a very niche use case, but honestly I kind of love the idea of like a massive quadrupedal flood form stomping into battle. I really hope we get a form like this someday. I mean, we kinda did in Halo Wars 2 with the Infestor form, but you know, I want something bigger. I want to see like a scarab-sized flood form, a boss battle with a scarab-sized flood form. We can keep dreaming. I present to you the Flood tier list. So today we are ranking every single flood form that has ever existed by its threat level, and as you can see here we have 5 levels of threat. We have the small potato tier, the beatable tier, the small chance of survival tier, the end of the world as we know it tier, and the it's so over tier. Also, make sure you stick around to the end because there's something at the end of this video that's, I will say, quite special that you're not going to want to miss. But without any further ado, let's rank these iconic, delicious flood forms. Delicious? Yeah, delicious. So starting out, we have the Abomination, the evolved version of the Juggernaut that we saw in Halo Wars 2 that is basically the Keymind form that exists prior to a Proto-Gravemind. Now, this is a tough one. I'm going to say for the Abomination, a small chance of survival. These things are very tough, they're very big, and they lead large armies of Flood. However, they are definitely killable with enough force, and the Flood haven't spread enough at this point to have like any kind of robust intelligence outside of the Abomination. So I think if you bring down an Abomination, all the local Flood become feral again. They basically go back to the feral stage. Well, they're in the feral stage, but they remain in the feral stage. They keep the traits of the feral stage. They aren't intelligent anymore. They aren't coordinated. So I think if you kill the Abomination early enough, then you can definitely stamp out a threat. However, killing it is not easy, so I think you could survive it. You just need to hit it with enough firepower, and you'd need to do so quickly before it can help form a real Proto-Gravemind. The Blightstalker. Now, this one is going to go in End of the World as we know it, and the reason for that is because if a Blightstalker exists, so too does a Blightland, and by extension, a Gravemind a Gravemind definitely does exist because the Blightstalker is a pure form, and for pure forms to exist, the Flood need to be in the coordinate stage of evolution, and for that to happen, you guessed it, a Gravemind has to exist. If you single-handedly encounter a Blightstalker in a Blightland, you're dead, like flat out. I don't think you're ever really going to kill this thing. Maybe like the prototype suit from Halo Legends would be enough to counter it, but based on at least what little we know about the Blightstalker, those things aren't designed for people to win encounters against. They're not designed for people to suddenly survive an encounter with. If you're in a Blightland and you meet a Blightstalker, you're done for. Ooh, the Bomber. Now, these guys are an interesting kind of carrier form. They're not actually a pure form. These are the guys in Halo Wars 1 that drop the sacks of infection forms. I think with these, they're gonna go unbeatable. I love these things. I think the faces look horrifying, really cool designs, but they're quite slow, quite cumbersome, quite large, so easy to spot. If you're not suddenly going to have one pop out of nowhere and drop a load of infection forms on you, you're going to see it coming. It's basically a Flood hot air balloon. They are definitely lethal, and they can spread the infection quite fast, but there are much better and much more lethal ways of the Flood infection spreading that go beyond the Bomber form. As much as I genuinely love these guys, they're beatable. They're definitely beatable. If you encounter these things, you can definitely counter them. And you know what? I'd say the same is going to go for the carrier form as well. Same kind of tier. Again, carrier forms are very slow, very cumbersome. They're lethal if they burst, but as we know, all it takes is an explosion or fire to basically neutralize them entirely. So if a force was prepared, they'd be able to put down a carrier form pretty easy without it having any major repercussions, I'd say. Now, combat forms. This is where it gets interesting. So I've lumped all the regular combat forms, so like grunts, jackals, humans, elites, brutes, etc., all together into one tier. It depends what stage of evolution the Flood is in for us to rank these, because if they're in the feral stage, I'd say, yeah, they're beatable, we can beat them. But if the Flood are in the coordinated, or God forbid, the galactic or transgalactic stage, then I'm not gonna lie, they're gonna go in the It's So Over category. Let me explain. So the combat forms as they are pretty lethal. They retain the knowledge and the wisdom and the information of their hosts, so not only can they operate weapons and vehicles, but they can also operate machinery and systems and networks if their hosts had that intelligence, or if the hive mind that they're connected to has that intelligence as well. But there's also the fact that they can spread the infection in two ways. So they can either incubate infection forms on their back and basically act as faster, more mobile carrier forms. They can literally bite people and spread the infection like a regular conventional zombie, which I always mention this, but I love the fact that the Flood can actually bite like a zombie. I really like that, makes them feel a bit more grounded. But the worst part of them is that if the Flood reach like the galactic or transgalactic stage, or hell, even the coordinated stage of evolution, the Gravemind can use them to transmit the logic plague remotely. That means that a combat form can be in the vicinity of any AI, any computer system, any computer network, anything digital, or hell, even anything biological, because biologicals, as we learned the other day in my last, or video before last, biologicals are equally as susceptible to the logic plague as digital things are. So combat forms, they can infect AIs, they can infect computer networks, they can infect people, they can infect anything. So honestly, the presence of a combat form, its threat level varies based on the stage of evolution that the Flood are in, but I'm gonna honestly put them in the it's over category, because if they can transmit the logic plague, that alone means that, like, I mean, all it takes is one horde of combat forms to go through a city, and the entire populace of that city, if they aren't infected, have gone insane. They've just completely lost it, and all their AIs, all their networks are compromised as well. It's game over at that point. It's so over. If you're enjoying this tier list, make sure you go and subscribe, and also follow me on Twitter at HiddenXperia, because if you don't, I'm going to put the Gravemind in small potatoes. Do you want to see me rank the Gravemind as a small potato? No? Okay, well, subscribe and follow. You know what to do. Okay, the Flood Bursters from Halo Wars 2. These are basically the subterranean carrier formers, basically, but they're a lot bigger than a regular carrier form. These guys, I'm going to put in end of the world as we know it, because unless a country or a planet is actively using seismic scanners to detect things under the ground, you're not going to have any idea these things are coming. You might feel a bit of a rumble under the ground, but before you know it, if you don't feel that, you're going to have a ton of infection forms bursting out right beneath you, and you had no idea. These things are low-key one of the most lethal forms of Flood, and I would say one of the only carrier forms, so to speak, that is actually genuinely hard to circumvent. Without seismic scanning, you're not going to have a clue these things are coming. Before you know it, they're going to be infecting an entire city, all from the ground. The Flood Supercell. Now, this is a bit weird because this kind of applies to everything. This is the absolute genesis, the root cause of the Flood is the Flood Supercell. So theoretically, you could put it in small potatoes, you could put it in the it's so over category. I'm going to say, I'm going to be fair here, and I'm going to treat it as a single entity. So imagine there was just like a single Flood Supercell on my table right now. You guys can't see it, right? But there's a Flood Supercell here. So what would happen if that was there? Well, if it made contact with my skin, I'm infected. Flat out. It doesn't even have to get in my airways or in my, like, go down my throat or be ingested into my bloodstream. Mere contact with it is enough. So I would say this thing, because it's so small, is so extremely lethal. I'm going to say end of the world as we know it for this, I think. I think that's fair, because it's responsible for everything that we know about the Flood and all the forms that exist, but it's not solely responsible. Even though it's the root cause of all of it, the forms themselves are responsible for most of the damage that they do. Like, for example, a Gravemind is responsible for all the stuff that a Gravemind does. Like, yes, a Flood Supercell helped create it and is the reason that it exists, but it's not the main cause of all the damage that it does, if that makes any sense. So I think end of the world as we know it is a fair tier for that. Okay, so next up we have the Flood Gaunt Pure Form, which is the one that we've only ever seen in that one Awakening the Nightmare cutscene in Halo Wars 2. These are a very lethal kind of pure form that basically act as assassins, but also command other Flood units as well, if I remember rightly. These guys are extremely tough, and also extremely lethal thanks to their, again, assassin-like tendencies. They also have really, really strong whips that can pin down, like, even the strongest of brutes. So I'm going to say these guys are beatable, but you'd have to be in a very specific situation, geared in a very specific way to beat them. So I'm going to say small chance of survival. Lower down, of course, than the Abomination, because the Abomination is one step away from a Proto-Gravemind. But they would be very, very, very hard to counter. We see how agile they are in that cutscene. You aren't just going to be able to, like, strafe that thing with a BR. Like, that's going to take a large squad to take down. Hell, that's going to take Spartans to take down. Okay, next up we have a Gravemind. I mean, this one is pretty obvious. If a Gravemind exists, chances are it's so over. Like, the Gravemind is, for all intents and purposes, the be-all, end-all. Obviously, things exist beyond the Gravemind, but chances are, if a Gravemind exists, you're screwed. That said, the only two instances of a Gravemind ever existing, the Flood have lost both times, so maybe not, but realistically, the existence of a Gravemind means that entire ecosystems have been consumed by the Flood. Literally thousands of tons of biomass has been consumed and recycled into its body. It can coordinate large amounts of flood forms on the ground, in vehicles, in ships in the air. I mean, it can use slip space, it can infect entire planets at some point, more on that in a minute. The existence of a Gravemind is basically the 4 horns of the apocalypse. Is it the 4 horns? 7 horns. There's something in the Bible about horns and the apocalypse. I remember that. And it's basically, it's the Flood equivalent of that. If a Gravemind exists, chances are you are screwed. There's no getting around that. Even a direct assault on a Gravemind is going to be so hard because of how populated and dangerous a Blightland is. The entire thing is filled with spores. It's patrolled by Blightstalkers. There's going to be tons of defenses in there, like stalks and flood dens. It's so difficult. The logic plague as well, like I said earlier, the fact that it can infect not only like sentients and biologicals, but AIs, computer systems, networks, the AIs on ships to control entire fleets. When we look at a Gravemind, it's better to look at what a Gravemind can't do than what a Gravemind can do, and that list is very, very small. So if a Gravemind exists, chances are it's so over. Oh, now this is going to be an interesting one. The Helion. I honestly think if this thing exists... this is tough. I'm going to say small chance of survival, but right at the top. So the Helion, if you don't know, is a siege flood pure form. It can twist and contort itself to basically alter its body to counter even the strongest defenses of an enemy. And the main point of this thing is to siege enemy bases, enemy encampments, enemy defenses. If an enemy has a base or any kind of defense or perimeter of any kind, this thing is designed to counter it. I know it can incubate and create tons of like infection forms, and I assume other pure forms as well, because it's meant to be pretty damn big. I think you could beat this thing with a lot of probably max strikes. I reckon max would probably take down a Helion, but based on how big they're supposed to be, infantry and even vehicles, I think, would have a really tough time with it, especially when you consider that it's not going to arrive at a base assault on its own. It's going to arrive at an enemy base with tons of other infection forms and combat forms and pure forms and God knows what else. So I think there is a very small chance that you could destroy and overcome a Helion, but if the Flood have got to the point where they can create one, and one arrives at your doorstep, you have a very, very small chance of survival. An infection form. Interesting. I actually don't know. One single infection form is enough to bring down an entire species. We know that. Shipmaster, Halfjaw told us that. But at the same time, one infection form, they are a lot bigger than people think they are, because obviously the sense of scale in the Halo games is dwarfed quite a lot by the fact that you're playing as like a deep 7-foot super soldier. But they're quite big and they're quite tough. I'm going to say beatable. I'm going to put them at the bottom of beatable. Obviously, they pose a massive, massive risk. And if an enemy's unprepared, then, well, kiss goodbye to your entire planet if one of these bad boys gets a hold of your spinal cord. But I think looking at them individually, they're definitely beatable, even by, like, regular people. I mean, they're not as fast as, say, the facehuggers from Alien. Like, you can definitely get around them. They jump quite slowly. They run fast, but I feel like you could dodge them. Maybe I'm overestimating myself here, but I feel like if an infection form was coming at me, I could probably smack it and, like, burst it. Like, within the force, I reckon you could do. So, I'm going to say beatable. Obviously, if we're talking about large hordes of them, I mean, if we're looking at a horde of infection forms, they're definitely going in end of the world as we know it. But individually, they're beatable. Trust me. I know that from experience. Another Halo Wars 2 pure form, the Infestor form. This thing, again, I'm going to put in small chance of survival, beneath the Abomination. Above the Gaunt, though, I think they're harder to defeat than the Gaunt. So these things are designed as anti-vehicle pure forms. The whole thing is that they're meant to latch themselves onto vehicles, send their like tentacles inside the vehicle, infect the crew, and then cover the vehicle in biomass and give it to the Flood, basically. And I mean, these things are fast from what I remember, quite tough and very agile. I mean, if you're in a Scorpion and one of these guys starts barreling towards you and you miss your shot with the cannon, you're screwed. Like, this thing is going to latch onto you, it's going to infect your vehicle, and it's going to infect you, and then it's going to take your Scorpion, and it's going to turn it on your friends. So I think this thing, again, there is a small chance of survival. You could definitely destroy this thing, you could definitely beat it, but because of how fast and agile it is, and how lethal it is, like, the thought process of being able to just instantly, like that, convert an entire, like, Scorpion, or Wraith, or Warthog, or anything like that is quite terrifying, and poses an extreme threat. Ah, my baby, the Flood Juggernaut, the Flood Juggernaut. This bad boy is again going to go into a small chance of survival. I would love to rank it higher because I love the Juggernaut so much. Anything that's like Halo 2 or cut Halo 2 content, I have a real soft spot in my heart for. But realistically, the Juggernaut is beatable. So the Juggernaut is basically controlled, at least from what I can gather, by the infection forms that are inside local combat forms. So a load of like the infection forms commanding combat forms come together to control the Juggernaut almost as another version of a combat form to act as their like local leader, but it's not a leader that commands them, rather they command it. And it also helps to kind of organize like hordes of combat forms in one area with hordes of combat forms in another area. So it's almost like a keymind form before a keymind form actually exists. It's the precursor to the Abomination, basically. Now, this thing, intelligence-wise, is really lethal. Like, being able to organize and command squads of combat forms, like, in whole different areas far apart from each other, is obviously really lethal when it comes to strategy and planning, but physically is where this thing shines, I think. I mean, the Juggernaut is huge, extremely strong, and at the same time, extremely agile. I mean, those tentacles it can use to, like, literally scale walls, and whilst also knocking other things away, hitting things, like, with immense power, I would assume, given the fact that it can drag itself up walls with just two of them. This thing can kind of do it all. Maybe I'd say the Juggernaut is like a jack of all trades, master of none. It's like it is literally an abomination, but not quite as advanced yet. But the Juggernaut, I think, would be very tough to beat because of its strength. However, at the same time, theoretically, if you killed all the combat forms in its area that had the infection forms in them that were commanding the Juggernaut, surely then the Juggernaut would just fall down. So instead of severing the head to like cause the army to discombobulate, you sever the army's head to discombobulate the Juggernaut. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense, but the Juggernaut is definitely beatable. As much as I love it, as much as I wish I could say that it's in the it's so over category, the Juggernaut is definitely a beatable combat form, technically. It's just going to take a lot of firepower to bring it down. Oh god, okay, so the old definition of a keymind, which now is just a planet-sized gravemind. I mean, if a gravemind has grown big enough to consume an entire planet, it was already so over when the gravemind came into existence, it's now even more over. I regret to inform that it has never been more over than it currently is. This thing is like the mark of death for the entire galaxy, to be honest with you. I mean, the fact that it's managed to consume an entire planet means that the Flood are now in the galactic stage. They can use slip space to traverse across the galaxy, spread to other colonies, spread to other planets, spread to other species. Do I need to put into words how over it would be if that happened? It would be so over. This thing is almost like the textbook definition of it's so over. Oh, okay, no, it's even more over if you happen to have a primordial. I mean, the primordial was a single entity, not a kind of entity, but I mean, the primordial was the first gravemind and the last precursor. I mean, the thing converted a Metarch class AI, mendicant bias, to the Flood. That alone is horrifying enough. I mean, again, I don't think I need to go into much detail as to why the last precursor that was also on the side of the Flood poses such a threat to be at the top of the it's so over category, but man, I mean, this thing is the whole reason that the Foreigners fell, that entire era of the galaxy was consumed by the Flood so much that they had to fire the entire Halo array. This thing is almost single-handedly responsible for the entire resetting of the galaxy, and indirectly for us existing as we are now. So I guess in a way we can thank the primordial, but at the same time, we should definitely not get anywhere near it, because if we do, it's going to start talking to us and then it's going to infect us. Trust me, you don't want to do that. A proto-grave mine. Now, this is the Halo 1 proto-grave mine, but as we saw in Halo Wars 1 and Halo Wars 2, the proto-grave mine can get a lot bigger than this. I'm going to say end of the world as we know it right at the top, because proto-grave mines are still combatable. They're still counterable. The Flood are still in the feral stage, so they're not particularly coordinated when these things exist. So you do stand a decent chance at stamping them out. However, the problem comes from if you kind of leave it to fester. Obviously, then it's going to turn into a grave mine. You know what? With that said, yeah, end of the world as we know it. I'm going to leave it there, actually, because if you leave it to fester, or worse, if you can't find it, then yeah, the world is screwed. But if you manage to find it, then you can definitely stamp it out, but you're going to have to be quick. The Ranger form. The Ranger is going to go in beatable, I'd say. The Ranger pure form is highly lethal. I mean, those calcium shards that it fires at you look pretty damn sharp, to put it lightly, and it has extreme range, extreme fire rate as well. I mean, bro, it pops those things out so fast, like a minigun. But at the same time, if you get near one of these things, even if it like coils up into the brace position like it likes to, you can still just beat it to death, or stick it with a grenade, or even like burn it or something like that. They are absolutely beatable. They're lethal, as with everything in the beatable category, but they're beatable. They're absolutely beatable. In fact, I'd say they're the most beatable of all of the pure forms in Halo 3. The Cedar. Now, this thing is basically an airborne infection form. However, I'm going to put it right at the bottom of a small chance of survival. And the reason for that is because, unlike the infection forms on the ground that aren't that fast typically, these things are fast and very nimble. They're small, they're thin, and they're very, very fast. Like, they're intended to infect aircraft and airships, which, I mean, that alone is quite terrifying. But even as like a standalone entity, when you take that away, they're still going to be really hard to kill, even with anti-air weaponry, because of how fast they move. Spartan combat forms. These things are going in end of the world as we know it, in between the Blightstalker and the Proto-Gravemind. We know that these things are counterable. We can kill them, but again, that requires you to have many nukes on hand, and that's not always the case, right? If one of these things is left unnuked after being infected, it is absolutely game over. I mean, the Flood then gain all of the knowledge of the Spartan program, all the ways to counter Mjolnir armor, all the problems with it, all the faults that obviously most people don't know, but technicians or Spartans that are wearing it will absolutely know all the downsides and all the faults of it. The Flood will know that, and they'll know how to counter any other Spartan. That, and also, I mean, a combat form running around in like 1-ton billion-dollar power armor that was meant to counter entire hordes of insurrectionists and later aliens is pretty bad. It's going to retain the strength and all the augmentations of the Spartans as well. The strength, the agility, the endurance, the intelligence as well. I mean, obviously that gets assimilated into the hive mind, but the sheer intelligence of a Spartan, a combat form having that level of intelligence is terrifying. These things, if they aren't nuked, honestly, if you don't nuke a Spartan combat form, this thing goes into it's so over. But the mere fact that a nuke can stop it means that it's going to go in end of the world as we know it. But man, I would honestly say that those things are as, you know what, I'm going to bump it up. It's more lethal than a Proto-Gravemind. I genuinely think that if left alone and unnuked, a Spartan combat form is going to do more damage than a Proto-Gravemind. Okay then, the aptly named spawner form. So these things aren't meant to be combat forms, rather they're a kind of pure form that exists purely, pun intended, to spawn infection forms, but they're a lot stronger than a carrier form, or a bomber form, or any other kind of infection form incubating form. How many times can I say form in 30 seconds? These things, I would say, go, yeah, probably like top of the carrier form section, but definitely unbeatable. It can run away, but it doesn't really have many defenses besides the infection forms that it spews out. So, I mean, you send some Hornets over, or some Hawks, that thing's dead quite easily. Okay, then, the Flood Spore. This bad boy, I think, is going to go into a small chance of survival, quite high up. I would say, yeah, about towards the top end. Not worse than an Abomination or a Helion, but not great. So it really depends on the environment and the people in the environment that a flood spore is kind of dissipated into. So if it's a civilian environment where nobody really knows anything about the flood, nobody is really geared up with NBC gear or anything like that, then like, yeah, it's so over at that point. However, if a force has like even the slightest little bit of knowledge about the flood and they know to wear NBC gear in an environment where there are spores can't do anything. They have to either make direct contact with the skin or be inhaled to infect a person. And if someone's wearing NBC gear, they are literally rendered useless. As long as that person, when they come out of a contamination zone, is decontaminated effectively, so there are no spores like resting on their gear or on their, like, I don't know, anywhere on their gear, then, like, if that's done, the spore is rendered completely useless. Then again, the reason that it's in a small chance of survival is because if these bad boys are dissipated into a civilian area, game over. Like, absolutely game over. You're gonna infect an entire city in like 10 minutes. Like, that easy. The Stalker form. The Stalker form, I think, is gonna go at the top of beatable. These guys are fast and very agile and very nimble, but they don't really do that much damage. They aren't really meant to attack. More so, they're meant to reposition so they can convert themselves into either a range form or a tank form. They are definitely beatable. The only reason that I've put them higher than the range form is because these guys are they're slippery buggers. They're slippery buggers. Even a Spartan struggles to catch them, right? These guys are gonna get out of your grasp. They're gonna dodge your bullets. They're gonna dodge explosions quite easily. They're not gonna pose much of a threat, at least on their own. When they transform, they're going to, but on their own, they're not gonna pose much of a threat. But I don't know. They're beatable, but they're definitely less beatable than a range form. Because, I mean, you get close to a range form, it's dead. You can't get close to a Stalker form. That thing is going to sprint away, climb up walls, it's going to jump over you. Like, that thing is going to be hard. Very hard. Ooh, the Flood Swarms from Halo Wars 1. Now, this is a good one. I think that these bad boys are going to go a small chance of survival if you encounter these things. Now, the reason for that is, yes, they're rather weak and they're just regular combat forms, but they're so nimble and agile and hard to hit. They're also really good at destroying aircraft as well, whilst, again, not to sound like a broken record, but remaining nimble and agile. They're thin, they're very small targets, and they're also, like, lethal against infantry as well. Those, again, like the range form, the calcium spikes that they spit out are pretty lethal. They look, again, in Halo Wars 1, they look pretty large. I assume also because they're a combat form, if they bite, like it looks like they can do, they have pretty violent looking mouths, then that bite will spread the infection. And I mean, all it will take is for one of these guys to swoop down real fast, bite somebody and swoop back up, and that person's infected. It's like 28 days later all over again. That guy is infected and it's game over. So I think if a large number of birds on a planet, that's another thing as well. Birds on at least Earth are obviously very abundant, and these things are just infected birds. So if this is any indication of what the average flood infected bird is going to be like, with the amount of them that there are on Earth, and I'd assume most other planets in the Halo universe as well, it's going to be really hard to combat them. The entire sky is going to be filled with infection vectors. So these guys, I think, if you encounter them, you can beat them, but you've got a pretty small chance of survival. Oh, the poor flood tadpole. Unfortunately, this is going to be the only small potato on today's list. I don't really know what these things are meant to be. I'm not sure if they're meant to be like waterborne infection forms with the idea that they infect water supplies, because if that were the case, they'd be like top tier, it's so over. But based on what little lore we have, it seems like they're just like early infection forms, basically. Like they're just like a precursor to an infection form that don't really do much. We've literally only ever seen them once in Halo 2, and that was it. Again, like I said, if they were waterborne infection forms that polluted water supplies, dude, if an ocean was filled with these things, game over. But we don't know that, so I can't rank them in the it's so over category. I've got to be fair. Unfortunately, the tadpole is, as much as it saddens me to say this, a small potato. Ah, the tank pure form, my favorite of Halo 3's pure forms. This bad boy is, I would say, above the swarm and below the abomination in a small chance of survival. These things are very tough, as the name implies, very hard to kill, extremely strong, granted, very slow, very cumbersome, but really hard to kill. That big, like, barbed muscle arm thing does immense damage to not only like infantry, but I would assume vehicles as well, given how strong it is. And also, another thing that people don't realize about the tanks is that they can also spawn infection forms, much like the spawner form, mobile on the field. So like all of a sudden, one of these bad boys can just go like bleh, and just like vomit out a bunch of infection forms, and you've got more potential infection vectors on the field. These guys would be really, really hard to take down without a coordinated strike force. Even Spartans struggle to take them down. I mean, that alone is a sign of how lethal they are. You could beat them, but if these things, again, started stomping through like a civilian city, absolutely game over. Even like, I think Marines would struggle to take down one of these bad boys unless they really coordinated their fire with grenades and rockets and grenade launchers as well. So very situational to take one of these bad boys down. I think in most circumstances, you're kind of screwed if you see one of these. And finally, we have a rather weird Halo Wars 1 combat form, the Thrasher. Now, this thing is basically an infected gorilla, at least that's what it looks like. Even the face looks a little bit gorilla-like, which is terrifying. I mean, gorillas, the ones that we have on Earth, are like some of the strongest things that this entire planet has ever created. Those things would annihilate almost any human easily. Like, bro, a gorilla's strength is unreal. And if that's what these are, or if they're like a derivative of that, then they are going to be, honestly, stronger than a tank form, I'd say. I'm going to rank these guys in a small chance of survival higher than the tank form, right? So I think they definitely lose to the tank in terms of not being able to vomit the infection forms, but at the same time, their strength and also their ability to bite, which of course spreads the infection, is pretty damn lethal. These guys in Halo Wars 1 were extremely tough, extremely fast as well for their size. The tank is slow for its size. This thing, really fast. It runs at you on all fours and bashes into you. I think these things would cause absolute havoc again, unless a force knew specifically how to counter them, which most wouldn't, because they've only ever been encountered on, what's the planet called? Etrin Harbridge, I think it was called, right? Like, no one knows how to counter these things. It would not be common knowledge. So I think that they would go pretty high up in a small chance of survival. If one of these things was running through a civilian city, even like a military FOB, game over. And so there you have it, my ranking of every single flood form by the threat that it poses. But like I said at the start of the video, there's something big I gotta show you, something exciting at the end of this video. So allow me to show you. It's time to rank the flood forms by their cuteness. There you have it. Merry Christmas, my friends. Today, we are going to look at what I think are the 3 most disturbing, creepy stories about the Flood from Halo's expanded universe, from their first sighting to the way they physically and mentally torture their infected hosts. Get ready to take what is already terrifying about the Flood and multiply it by 7 billion. Number 3. Summer the Painter. Summer the Painter is a beautifully terrifying story because it tells the beginning of the end of the Foreigners from the viewpoint of someone so unprepared and defenseless. The story focuses on a foreigner called Summer, who chose to give up her power armor, her weapons, and her hyper-intelligent life-guiding AI to live out the rest of her days in a more primitive manner on a planet called Seaward. Now, Seaward was a planet right on the edge of known space. It's the last stop before the null and void of interstellar space, and it essentially acted as a rich person's getaway, a secret planet that nobody in the general or government populace even knew about, owned by some very rich, very secretive foreigners. The kicker is that it had no ties to the rest of the foreigner civilization. That means no communications, no travelers stopping by, no government officials checking in on it, absolutely no ties to the rest of the galaxy whatsoever. And that makes this story even more frightening. The story follows Summer painting the sunset with her jet brush, which is essentially a futuristic paintbrush that paints what it can see. Now, she's waiting for this perfect moment where the 2 suns of Seaward meet and create this beautifully blinding array of colours in the sky, so bright that she has to close her eyes while the brush paints it.
As the two suns meet, the sky gets so bright that Summer has to close her eyes, and in the background the jet brush does the painting for her. When she opens her eyes, she looks at the board that she was painting on, and all of the colours are there. All the beautiful array of colours are there on the page. But there was something else present. A dark imperfection, bursting through the clouds with a sickly yellow smoke trailing behind it, had been painted. Summer checked the sky, thinking that maybe it was just a glitch with her brush, but lo and behold, that imperfection was still there, and it was slowly crashing down towards Seaward's surface. After 10,000 years of absence, the flood had returned. Seaward then went on to be the first planet of millions to be infected by the flood. It was totally defenseless and was overwhelmed, infected, and turned into a diseased rock in no time whatsoever, and it Number 2. Defender of the Storm. Defender of the Storm is one of the few flood stories in the Halo canon that's like a good old-fashioned, proper zombie survival horror story, and it's why it's one of my favourites. So, the story follows a Forerunner warrior servant called Adequate Observer, who's stationed on board a Forerunner gas mine, pretty much like that one that we went to in Halo 2. The story's set towards the end of the Forerunner Flood War, which was an extremely bleak time for the Halo universe, considering the Flood had pretty much consumed everything in multiple galaxies. Surrounding the central hub of the mining facility are several weather vanes, and every 3 weeks the guards have to go and patrol the weather vanes to make sure they're safe and secure. And also, every year, a transport ship comes to the mine to exchange guards and workers to go and fight the Flood. After 15 years of passing it off, this was finally going to be the year that Adequate Observer clocked out of the mine and finally joined the exciting fight against the Flood on the front lines. He'd been seeing these weird avian creatures through the windows recently, and despite his AI saying that he wasn't seeing anything, it was starting to creep him out because birds shouldn't exist. In weather as volatile as the weather surrounding the mining hub, there's no way that birds could possibly exist there. However, when the transport ship arrived, so did the Flood. Adequate watched from the monitors in the central hub as the Flood ravaged the outer vanes, infecting his friends and killing his acquaintances as they spread throughout the facility. After trying and failing to save one of his friends in Vane 2, he got trapped as the door to the hub locked, and then to get back to the central hub, he had to crawl through these tight, dark ventilation shafts, with all of the exits blocked by various combat forms, the sounds of them echoing throughout the shafts. When he made it back to the central hub, he ultimately found out that everyone on board the station was sent to the mine to die fighting the Flood. Their entire purpose was to die and distract the Flood. The reason being, those bird things that Adequate thought he saw through the windows were real, and he did actually see them. They had the ability to survive in extremely harsh weather. If the Flood were able to infect these and use them, they'd be extremely dangerous, so the mine was created and put there almost as a decoy to draw the Flood away from the center of the planet where the birds lived, and instead towards these fresh Forerunner hosts on board the station. After dealing with the revelation that the mine essentially acted as death row for the Flood, Adequate scuttled the station, sending it plummeting to the center of the planet and killing all the Flood on board, and destroying all of the biomass they'd accumulated. However, Adequate somehow survived the fall and was stuck in the eye of the storm, with nothing but his AI and the bird creatures to keep him company forevermore. And in the number 1 spot, we have the infection and death of Private Wallace Jenkins. Okay, so this one is without a doubt the creepiest and most disturbing Flood story because it goes into the raw details of the infection process. The physical and psychological torture that the infection form puts a host under is experienced through the eyes of Private Wallace Jenkins, the guy who recorded the initial outbreak on Installation 04 during Halo Combat Evolved, the guy who watched everybody apart from Sergeant Johnson get infected. During that initial outbreak, everybody in his squad, aside from Johnson of course, was infected, but the infection form that infected Jenkins was quite old from being stored for so long and it was weak, so it didn't properly infect him. During infection, the infection form normally kills the host and then infects it, but in the case of Jenkins, it didn't kill him. So that means that he became like 90% combat form, and remained like 10% Wallace Jenkins. He could still control himself, partly, but most of the time he had to just sit there and watch as the infection form controlled all but his mind. Under no control of his own, Jenkins' body was taken to the surface with a load of other combat forms to attack a group of ODSTs, and whenever he got the chance, Jenkins tried to get himself killed. He'd take over the infection form and try and walk towards the fire, but he failed to do so and was captured and interrogated by the ODSTs. Before this, he'd also tried to throw himself off a cliff to commit suicide because the physical and mental torture was too much, but every time he got to the edge of the cliff, the infection form would regain control and make him walk back. It's quite a disturbing situation. During the interrogation, the infection form kept regaining control, attempting to attack the ODSTs by extending a tentacle out of Jenkins' arm, snapping his bones, bursting his veins, and tearing his skin, creating immense physical pain, well, as you'd imagine. But occasionally, the pain would knock the infection form out, which gave Jenkins a tiny opportunity to gain physical control back, during which he tried to desperately tell the ODSTs about the true horror and potential of the Flood. Jenkins also actually managed to save Earth. He informed the ODSTs, who were going to use the Truth and Reconciliation to get back to Earth, not to use it and not to take it to Earth because it was heavily infested by the Flood, and doing so would cause a massive outbreak and ultimately the fall of Earth, so instead they destroyed it, wiping out a shitload of Flood on board and finally laying Private Wallace Jenkins to rest, free of his parasitical torture.